The morning she was cast out of the only home she had ever known, Ellie Whitfield stood barefoot on the pine floor of her uncle's office and counted the coins he had placed in her palm. There were $4 silver, a thin fold of paper bills, and a single copper penny that had been polished by the sweat of many pockets before it had come to rest in hers. $87. That was the number Warren Whitfield had written across the top of the ledger page, underlined twice, and blotted with a strip of green felt. $87 for 13 years of a girl's life. $87 for the daughter of the brother he had buried in a pine box during the fever year and had never once spoken of again. She did not cry. She had learned before she was 7 years old that tears in that house drew nothing but a raised eyebrow and a lecture on the weakness of women who had not been born to hard country. So she stood there in her mended calico dress with the coins warming in her hand, and she looked at the small brass compass in her pocket, and she thought of the road east, and she thought of her father, and she said nothing. But this is not the story of a girl who was thrown away. This is the story of what she found when she followed a rusted rail line into a desert that everyone said led nowhere. And what she found there was not a shack. It was not a ruin. It was something so large, so strange, and so utterly unexpected that when she first saw it rising out of the flat red earth, she thought she had walked into a dream. Settle in for this one, my friend. Pour yourself a cup of coffee or whatever warms you in the evening hours, and let this old desert wind carry you back to the year 1902, when the West was still wide and the train still ran on faith, and a 19-year-old girl with $87 to her name walked into the Sonora Flats and changed her life with nothing but her father's compass and the stubborn patience he had taught her before he died. Her name, as the county records still show, was Eleanor Whitfield. Ellie to those who had loved her, and there had been very few. She was born in the spring of 1883 in a two-room adobe cottage on the outskirts of a survey post called Willow Bend, which no longer appears on any map because the wind and the drought and the passage of years have long since scrubbed it clean from the face of the territory. Her father was Thomas Whitfield, and Thomas Whitfield was a cartographer for the Territorial Survey Office, which is to say he was one of those quiet, patient men who walked out into the empty country with a brass transit and a leather satchel of vellum sheets, and came home weeks later with the land drawn true and small on paper, so that other men could argue about who owned what and where the boundaries ran. I was not a rich man. A cartographer's pay in those years was modest, and much of it went to the horses and the instruments and the good black ink he insisted on ordering from a stationer in St. Louis because he did not trust the muddy ink sold at the local mercantile. But he was a kind man. He was a man who wore reading spectacles low on his nose and hummed old hymns when he worked. And he was the kind of father who, when his small daughter climbed onto his stool beside him at the drafting table, would take her hand in his own ink-stained hand and guide it across the paper, teaching her how to draw a contour line clean and true. The workshop where he did his work was a small room at the back of the cottage, and it smelled of linseed oil and paper and the faint sharpness of the sage that grew outside the window. Ellie's earliest memories were of that room, the soft north light coming through the single wide window, the clean rows of pencils lined up on a wooden tray, the way her father would spread a fresh sheet of vellum across the drafting board and smooth it with the flat of his hand as if he were laying a blanket over a sleeping child. She remembered the sound of his voice more than she remembered the words. It was a low voice, unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned to speak to itself out in the long silences of the survey country and had come to prefer that company. He taught her to read maps before she could read words. He would spread out a chart of the surrounding country on the workshop floor and set her on her belly beside him, and he would trace with his finger the fine looping lines of the contours and say, "Here, Ellie, this is where the hill rises. See how the lines crowd together, that means the slope is steep. And here where they spread out, that is a gentle place, a valley, a resting place. The land tells its story if you know how to listen." She would nod solemnly as small children do when they are being taken seriously by their fathers, and she would put her own small finger on the paper and follow the lines, and she would feel that she was reading something older and deeper than any book she would ever open. There was a particular map he showed her more than once in that last year before the fever. It was a large map of the whole territory, drawn on a single sheet of heavy vellum, and it showed the whole of the country from the Bitter River in the north to the low blue rise of the Dragoon Mountains in the south. He had drawn it himself over the course of 2 summers, walking every ridgeline he had marked with his own boots. He would spread it out on the workshop floor on Sunday afternoons, when the day's work was done and the light was long, and he would set Ellie beside him on the floor and let her trace her small finger along the routes he had walked. Every line on this map, he told her once, is a story. Every line is a place where a man once stood and looked out and decided that the world was worth remembering. She thought about that a great deal in the years that came after. He taught her the names of the stars. On summer nights when the heat came up out of the ground and the cottage was too warm to sleep in, he would carry her outside on his shoulder and set her down on a folded wool blanket in the yard, and he would name the constellations one by one. Orion the hunter, Cassiopeia the queen, the great bear who circled the pole and never set, and the North Star, which he called Polaris, and which he told her was the one star in all the sky that a traveler could truly trust. The others move, Ellie, he would say, but that one holds. That one is the true one. If you are ever lost, find that star and you will find your way home. He taught her the compass. He had one of his own, a heavy brass field compass with a jeweled bearing and a needle that he had adjusted with his own hand, and he would let her hold it when they walked out into the country together. He showed her how to lay it flat in her palm and wait for the needle to settle. He showed her how to align it with the distant peaks and read the bearing off the etched rim. He told her that a compass was not a magical thing. It was a truthful thing. It told you what was there, whether you wished it to be there or not. And he told her more than once that she should always trust the needle more than she trusted the voices of men who claimed to know the way. And on her 6th birthday, he told her that he was making her a compass of her own. It was to be smaller than his and lighter sized for the hand of a girl. He had turned the case himself from a solid billet of brass on the small lathe he kept in the corner of the workshop. He had polished it until it caught the light like a small warm sun. And he had set into the center of the needle at the pivot a tiny sliver of turquoise stone that he had found in a washout beyond the Painted Cliffs during a survey trip the summer before. A fleck of sky, he called it. A piece of the sky to guide her on the earth. She did not receive that compass on her 7th birthday, because before her 7th birthday the fever came first. It came in the late autumn of 1889 when Ellie was 6 years old and the cottonwoods were already yellow along the creek. It was one of those quiet plagues that used to move through the small settlements of the frontier country in the days before there was anything to be done about them. A fever with no name. A sickness that took a man in 3 days and did not ask him whether he was ready to go. It came to Willow Bend on the wagon of a traveling salesman, and it took Ellie's mother first on a Tuesday in the early hours of the morning before the birds had begun to sing. It took her father 5 days later on the following Sunday at about the time the sun was setting behind the mesa. Ellie herself did not fall ill. That was the strange, sharp mercy of it. She sat in the corner of the room and watched them both go one after the other, and she did not understand what was happening. She only knew that when the neighbor woman came at last to collect her, the woman took her by the hand and led her out of the cottage and told her in a soft voice that she was going to have to be a brave girl now. Ellie asked where her father was going. The woman did not answer. They buried Thomas Whitfield beside his wife under a wooden cross behind the little chapel at Willow Bend. Ellie stood at the graveside in a dress that was too small for her, holding a bunch of dried sage that someone had put into her hand, and she watched the men shovel the red earth back into the hole, and she did not cry then either. She had already forgotten how. In the weeks that followed, everything her family had owned was sold to settle small debts. The house, the horses, her father's drafting table, his brass transit, his good pens, everything. Everything except one small pine trunk that the neighbor woman had set aside because she said it was not right to sell a child's inheritance for the price of a barrel of flour. Inside that trunk were a dozen of her father's finished survey maps rolled and tied with twine, a leather-bound field notebook, a small oil portrait of Ellie's mother as a young woman, and the compass. The little brass compass, with the turquoise needle still unwrapped in its cloth, still waiting for the seventh birthday that had never come. Ellie kept the trunk with her when they put her on the wagon and sent her south to her father's older brother, the only living relative she had. His name was Warren Whitfield, and he ran a cattle operation of some 800 acres in the drylands south of the Sonora Flats, and he had never once in all the years of her father's life come to visit his brother's family. He agreed to take the girl in because it was his Christian duty, or so he said. What he meant was that he could not in front of the neighbors be seen to refuse. Warren Whitfield was a hard man. That is the best way to describe him, and it is also the only fair way because he did not pretend to be otherwise. He was a rancher in the old sense of the word, a man who had built his herd from a handful of stolen mavericks in the years after the war, and had grown it through blood and drought, and the ruthless application of a clear-eyed will into one of the largest operations in the county. He measured the world in acres and in head of cattle. He measured his workers in the amount of daylight they were willing to burn. He measured his own life so far as anyone could tell in the closing entries at the bottom of his leather ledger book, which he kept on a shelf beside his bed as other men might keep a Bible. His wife Ellie's aunt was a woman named Cordelia. She had been pretty once in the pictures. Now she was thin, and her mouth was thin, and her hands were red from the constant scrubbing that a ranch house demands. And she looked at Ellie with the tired, distant look of a woman who has been asked to carry one more burden than she can rightly manage. She was not cruel, she was simply used up. There was nothing left in her to give to a small girl who was not her own. They did not put Ellie in the main house. That was decided within a week of her arrival. There was a line shack on the northeastern edge of the property a half-mile from the main compound built originally to house a herder during the summer grazing. It had a small stove, a single cot, a wash basin, and a window that looked out across the flats toward the distant rise of the Calico Range. Warren Whitfield informed his niece in a tone that admitted no discussion that this was to be her room. She would take her meals in the bunkhouse with the hands when the work permitted, and in her shack when it did not. She would earn her keep like any other soul on the property. She was 6 years old. The first winter she spent in that shack was the hardest. She was too small to reach the top of the little stove, and the wood she was given was green and would not stay lit through the night, and she would wake in the small hours with her breath visible in the cold air, and the wind coming in around the door frame in thin whistling threads. She did not complain. There was no one to complain to. She learned that winter the small trick of pulling her spare dress over her nightgown and folding the wool blanket in a certain way that trapped the heat of her body against her legs. And she learned the trick of building the fire down small in the evening so that the coals would still be warm when she woke. And she learned the trick of putting on her boots before she stood up so that the packed earth floor would not steal the warmth out of the soles of her feet. These were small tricks. She lived by them. For 13 years, she lived in that shack. 13 years. Think on that number for a moment. 13 years is a long time in the life of any human being. It is longer than a boyhood. It is longer than a war. It is longer than most marriages last in this hard country. Ellie Whitfield spent 13 years in a one-room line shack on the edge of her uncle's ranch. And in those 13 years, she was fed, and she was clothed, and she was worked, and she was seldom spoken to except in the giving of instruction. She mended the fences on the north pasture. She darned the socks of the ranch hands. She kept the kitchen garden behind the main house. She hauled water. She scrubbed pots. She learned to plait rope to skin a rabbit, to render tallow to cure hides, and to keep her mouth shut in the presence of her uncle. She had in all that time 2 friends, not many, 2. But they were enough. They were enough to keep the small ember of her father's memory alive in her. And they were enough to teach her the things she would need to know when the day came at last that the ledger closed on her. The first was an old ranch hand named Cyrus Bell. He was already an old man when Ellie came to the ranch, And by the time she was 19, he was very old indeed, with white hair that hung in a long braid down his back and hands that were mapped with the scars and calluses of a lifetime of physical work. Cyrus had been with the Whitfield operation for 30 years. He was a widower, his wife long buried in a small graveyard back in Missouri, and he had no children of his own that he ever spoke of. He was a man of few words, but the words he had were good ones, and when he spoke, Ellie listened. Cyrus was the one who taught her the things that a rancher's son would have been taught. He showed her how to set a fence post so that it would still be standing 30 years later, how to read the weather by the shape of the clouds, how to handle a mule without getting kicked, how to sharpen a knife on a wet stone until the edge would part a hair, how to strike a nail with 3 clean strokes of the hammer and no wasted motion and no wasted breath. He did not teach her these things because he thought she would ever need them in the way a boy would need them. He taught her because he saw a child who was hungry to learn and who had nobody else to teach her, and because he was in his quiet way a decent man. He taught her one other thing too that she thought about often in later years. She was 10 years old at the time, and she had come running to him one evening in the barn with her hands wet with tears because Cordelia had scolded her for breaking a china cup and had told her that she was clumsy and had told her that she was useless and had told her that she would come to a bad end. Cyrus had been oiling a bit of harness by the light of a lantern, and he had set the harness down when he saw her, and he had wiped his big, gnarled hands on his trousers, and he had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had said, "Girl, what did she call you?" Ellie had told him. Cyrus had thought about it. He had said at last, "Words are like weather, girl. They come and they go. You don't have to take them inside. You can let them pass over you like weather." Then he had picked up the harness again and gone back to oiling it, and Ellie had stood there for a while, and had wiped her face on her sleeve, and had walked back to her shack, and had, without quite realizing it, become 1 degree stronger than she had been when she had run to him. She never forgot that lesson. She used it over the years more times than she could count. The second friend was a woman named Hannah Doyle. She was the cook in the main house. She had been the cook for 18 years, and she had raised 3 sons of her own on a small holding down the road, and she had lost 2 of them to bad luck and the other to the drink, and she had come to work for the Whitfields because there was no other work to be had. Hannah was a big woman, broad in the shoulders and broad in the hip, with a red face and a way of laughing that sounded like a rusted hinge, but was in truth the kindest sound Ellie had ever heard. Hannah could not do much for the girl openly. Cordelia watched the kitchen too closely, but now and then on the coldest mornings of winter when Ellie came in from her chores with her hands blue and her teeth chattering, Hannah would slip her a piece of hot bread wrapped in a clean rag, and she would say in a low voice, "Warm your hands on that child and don't let her see you." And Ellie would take that bread out into the yard behind the smokehouse and sit on a stump and eat it slowly, and she would feel for a few minutes at a time that she was still a person in the world. Hannah gave her one other thing once that Ellie kept. It was on a cold February morning when Ellie was 15 years old, and Hannah had caught her weeping quietly behind the smokehouse because she had been carrying the memory of her mother's face all morning, and it had suddenly, for no reason she could name, become too heavy to carry. Hannah had come out with a shawl over her shoulders and had sat down on the stump beside Ellie, and had not asked her what was wrong and had not tried to comfort her with words. She had simply reached into the deep pocket of her apron and had taken out a small folded handkerchief. She had unfolded it. Inside was a single dried rose petal, brown at the edges, but still holding faintly the shape and the ghost of a color. "That was from my boy Ephraim's grave," Hannah had said quietly. "I pressed it in a book. I have kept it 15 years. She had folded it back into the handkerchief. She had put it into Ellie's hand. "You take it, child. You keep it. When the missing gets too big, you hold something small in your hand, and you remember that other people have missed people too, and they have gone on missing them, and they have still gotten up in the morning." Ellie had kept that handkerchief in her pine trunk with her father's maps for 4 years. She still had it folded flat on the morning she walked out of the ranch. Those were her 13 years, the bread from Hannah, the lessons from Cyrus, the weight of the brass compass in her pocket, which she carried with her every day and every night, and which she never once showed to another soul on the ranch. Some things her father had taught her are for you alone. Some things you keep, some things you carry. And then, in the late spring of the year 1902, on a Tuesday morning that had begun like any other Tuesday morning in the 13 years of her life at that ranch, Warren Whitfield called for her from the porch of the main house and told her in a voice that carried across the yard to come into his office. She was in the garden when the call came. She was pulling weeds from the onion row and her hands were black with the good damp earth. And she stood up slowly and wiped her hands on the front of her apron and looked at her uncle across the yard. He was standing on the porch in his shirt sleeves with his hands on his hips, and he was not looking at her. He was looking past her out at the flats. That was how she knew, even before she reached the porch, that something was coming. She washed her hands at the pump. She untied her apron and hung it on the nail by the kitchen door. She walked through the cool of the main house past the parlor where Cordelia sat sewing without looking up and down the hall to the office at the back. The door was open. Warren was already inside, standing behind his heavy oak desk with a manila envelope in front of him, closed its flap tucked under. He did not offer her a chair. He did not need to. There was no chair for her. Eleanor, he said, and he used her full name, which he had used perhaps a dozen times in 13 years, sit down. She looked at him. There was no chair. He looked at the space where a chair should have been, seemed to notice for the first time that there was none, and did not move to correct it. He waved a hand dismissively and simply said, "Never mind. Stand there. This won't take long." And it did not take long. He explained it to her in the clean, dry, professional tone he used with cattle buyers and with the men from the bank. He had sold the northeastern parcel of the ranch, the parcel that contained her line shack, the parcel that had been for 13 years the only home she had known. The buyer was a speculator, he said, and the buyer wanted the land clear and vacant on the day of closing, which was to be the following Monday. He had therefore no further use for her presence on the property. His own son Robert was to be married in the fall, and Robert's bride would be taking over the management of the household gardens, which had been Ellie's principal responsibility. Her position, he said, had become redundant. He said the word redundant slowly, as if he wanted her to hear it clearly. Redundant. He gestured to the envelope on the desk. Inside, he said, was the sum of $87. He had calculated it with care. $50 was the inheritance her father had left for her, a small life policy that Thomas Whitfield had taken out in the year before his death, and which Warren had held in trust for her all these years, minus certain administrative deductions, which he did not itemize. The remaining $37 was what he considered a fair final settlement for her years of labor. He noted without any change in his voice that room and board over the same period had been more than sufficient compensation for the ordinary value of her work, but that he was choosing out of family feeling to add the $37 as a gesture. He used the word gesture. He did not use the word wage. Ellie stood there. Her hands were clasped behind her back the way Cyrus had taught her to stand when she was being spoken to by a man who held her livelihood in his hand. She listened. She did not interrupt. She did not weep. When he was finished, he pushed the envelope toward her across the polished surface of the desk. She stepped forward. She picked up the envelope. She opened it because she wanted him to know she was not afraid to count it in front of him. And she counted the 4 silver dollars and the paper bills and the single copper penny that had somehow ended up in the mix. $87. Exactly. She refolded the envelope. She looked up at her uncle, and she said in a voice that was as steady as the needle of her father's compass one word: "Thank you." She said it because she wanted to see if he would flinch. He did not flinch. He nodded once the way a man nods when a piece of business has been concluded to his satisfaction, and he told her that she had until sunrise the day after next to collect her things and leave the property. Then he sat down at his desk and opened the ledger book, and he began to write, and the meeting was over. She walked out of the office. She walked out of the main house. She walked back to the shack that had been her home for 13 years. And when the door was closed behind her and the latch was down and there was no one to see, she stood in the center of the small room with the envelope in her hand, and she allowed herself for one single moment to feel it, the full weight of it, the full, cold, clean, terrible clarity of what had just been done to her. And then she set the envelope on the little pine table by the window, and she began to pack. That would have been the end of it. That would have been the entire story of Ellie Whitfield, dismissed at 19 with $87 in a canvas sack, if not for two things that happened that night. Two small things, two hinges on which her whole life turned. The first happened after sundown. She had finished her packing. There was very little to pack: a spare calico dress, a wool blanket that Cyrus had given her one Christmas folded neatly at the bottom of the sack, a small whetstone, a sturdy folding knife, a bar of yellow lye soap, a tin cup, a worn deck of playing cards that Hannah had passed to her one summer when the boredom had grown too heavy to bear, a packet of dried jerky, and a small cloth sack of cornmeal. Hannah's small handkerchief with the pressed rose petal folded and refolded, and the pine trunk with her father's maps, which she could not take with her, but which she had opened one last time to look through, as one might look through a photograph album on the eve of a long journey. The sky outside had gone a deep bruised purple, and the coyotes had begun their evening singing out on the flats. She had lit no lamp. She was sitting on her cot in the near dark with the trunk open in front of her when she heard voices coming from the direction of the main house. Now the shack was a half-mile from the main compound. Voices did not as a rule carry that far. But the wind that evening was blowing off the flats and toward the ranch, and it was carrying sound in the way that dry desert air will sometimes carry sound over great distances, clear as a bell. She heard her uncle's voice first. She knew it at once. And then she heard another voice, a voice she did not know, a man's voice, cultured and low, with the flat clipped cadence of the East. She stood up. She went to the window. She could see from the window the small yellow square of light that was the window of her uncle's office. She could see two silhouettes moving inside, and she could hear on the wind fragments of what they were saying. She heard the word calico. She heard it 3 times. She heard the phrase water rights spoken by the stranger in that cultured Eastern voice in a tone of some satisfaction. She heard her uncle laugh, which was a thing she had not heard in perhaps a decade, and the laugh was not a pleasant sound. She heard the stranger say something about the survey and about the girl and about how the whole matter would be tidied up within a matter of months and that no one would ever be the wiser. And then, quite clearly, carried on that dry wind straight across the half-mile of open ground, she heard the stranger say, "And if the girl should come to grief out in that country, Warrenwell, 19-year-old girls come to grief in the Sonora Flats every summer, there would be no one to inquire." Her uncle's voice in reply was too low to catch, but she heard him laugh again. She stood at the window for a long time. She did not move. She did not weep. She did not, for that matter, feel afraid, which is a strange thing to say, but it is the truth, because what she felt in that moment was something older and colder than fear. What she felt was the sensation of a map unfolding in her mind. The sensation her father had described to her once, when she was very small, of seeing all at once the shape of a country she had thought she knew. She was not being dismissed because she was redundant. She was being dismissed because she was in the way. There was something out there in the Sonora Flats, something along the Calico Spur, something that involved water rights and surveys and money enough to bring a well-dressed Eastern speculator to her uncle's office in the middle of the night. And her uncle had been paid, or was about to be paid, to see her removed from the picture. And if she should die out there in the country he was sending her towards, so much the better. There would be no one to inquire. She stood at that window until the light in the office went out, and the stranger's horse could be heard trotting away down the road to town, and the silence of the desert came back down over the ranch like a heavy blanket. Then she turned back to the room and she lit her small stub of candle, and she sat down on the cot beside the open trunk, and she picked up the compass. She had held that compass 10,000 times in 13 years. She knew every ridge of the knurled brass rim, every faint scratch on the glass face, every small imperfection in the turn case. She had never once in all that time thought of the compass as anything but what it appeared to be. A field compass, a gift from her father, a memory made solid small enough to hold in her hand. But now, sitting in the near dark with the candle guttering and the coyotes singing and her uncle's laugh still ringing in the back of her mind, she found herself looking at the compass differently. She turned it over. She looked at the back of the case. The base was a smooth, slightly domed disc of polished brass, and there was at the very center of that disc a small circular seam. She had noticed the seam before, of course. She had thought it was nothing more than the joining of the base to the wall of the case, a routine feature of the turner's work. She pressed her thumbnail into the seam. She twisted gently, and the base, which she had thought for 13 years was a solid piece of brass, moved. It moved just the tiniest fraction, but it moved in the way a threaded fitting moves when it has not been opened in a long time. She held her breath. She twisted again harder, and with a soft, dry click, the base of the compass unscrewed in her hand and came away and revealed beneath it a shallow hollow no larger than a coin. Inside the hollow, folded and folded again into a square, so tight that it barely filled the space, was a small piece of vellum. She lifted it out with fingers that had suddenly begun to tremble. She unfolded it slowly, careful of its brittleness. It was a map. It was drawn in her father's hand. She knew the hand at once, the fine looping strokes of the pen, the small, precise labels, the delicate hatching of the ridgelines. It was a map of a country she did not immediately recognize. Then she saw the label, Sonora Flats Eastern Section, and she saw along the eastern edge of the map the thin double line of a rail spur drawn in her father's careful ink, the Calico Spur, and she saw near the terminus of that spur a small square marked with a red circle, and beside the red circle, in her father's smallest and most careful hand, 3 words, "For Ellie, when she is ready." She sat there in the dark for a long time. The map lay open on her knee, the candle burned down. Outside, the coyotes went silent, and the wind changed, and the first pale gray of morning began to show at the eastern edge of the sky. She did not know in that moment everything that lay ahead of her. She did not know about the tower yet. She did not know about the box under the hearthstone, or the letter from a woman she had never met, or the hidden town in the canyon, or the son who had been mourned as dead. She did not know that in 3 weeks' time, she would be standing on a rise in the flats, looking up at the strangest and most beautiful things she had ever seen. She did not know that in 6 months' time her uncle would come to her door on a horse thin with drought, and that she would have to decide in that moment what kind of woman she had become. She knew only 3 things. She knew that her uncle had lied to her. She knew that her father had loved her and had left her something and had trusted her to find it. And she knew that the road east along the rusted line of the Calico Spur was no longer a road into nowhere. It was a road home. She left the ranch before sunrise the next morning. Not the following day, as her uncle had permitted. The following morning. She wanted to be gone before the household woke. She did not say goodbye to Cordelia because there was no goodbye to say. She stopped at the bunkhouse only long enough to slip a folded scrap of paper under the door of Cyrus Bell's small room, on which she had written in careful pencil only 2 words: "Thank you." She stopped at the kitchen door and set on the step a small tin wrapped in a cloth containing the last of a batch of wild honey she had gathered the summer before and had been saving for no particular reason. She left it for Hannah. She did not sign it. Hannah would know. Then she shouldered her canvas sack, and she settled her father's compass in her right pocket and the folded map in the inside pocket of her jacket close to her heart, and she walked out of the yard and down the long dirt track toward the main road, and she did not look back. The road to Purgatory Springs ran roughly east across the dry lands, some 30 miles as the crow flies, but nearer 40 on foot, and Ellie walked it in 2 long days. She kept to the shoulder where the walking was easier, and she rested through the worst heat of the afternoons, in whatever shade she could find, and she drank sparingly from her water skin, because Cyrus had taught her that a body dies not from the lack of water, but from the panicked overuse of what water it has. She slept the first night in the shelter of a shallow arroyo with her canvas sack for a pillow and the wool blanket over her shoulders. She heard the coyotes again closer this time. She was not afraid. She thought about her father a great deal on that walk. She thought about the compass and the map and the way he had turned the case himself on a small lathe, and the way he must have known when he closed the little hollow with its folded vellum inside that he might not be there to open it with her. She thought about what it must have cost him to prepare that small gift for a future he could not be sure of. She thought about her mother, whose face she remembered less clearly with each passing year, whose voice she remembered not at all. She thought about the shack she was leaving and the shack she was walking toward, and about the way a life could be measured in the end, in the small rooms one had passed through. She walked and she thought, and by the time the second sunset came, the road had become in her mind less a distance to be covered than a slow reading of a page. On the second afternoon, she came over the last rise and saw Purgatory Springs laid out below her in the shimmering heat. It was not much of a town. It was a scatter of false-fronted buildings along a single wide street, a livery stable, a mercantile, a saloon or two, a small chapel with a crooked bell tower, and at the far end of the street, a squat one-story adobe building with a hand-painted sign above the door that read, Territorial Land Office. That was the building she wanted. She walked down the street with her sack over her shoulder and her eyes forward. Men watched her from the porches. She was used to being looked at. She let it pass over her like weather. She stopped at the pump in front of the livery and refilled her water skin. She ate a strip of jerky. She smoothed the front of her dress with the flat of her hand. Then she walked to the land office and pushed open the door. The office smelled of paper and old cigar smoke, and the faintly sour scent of a man who did not bathe often. Behind a long wooden counter at a high desk sat the territorial land clerk. His name, according to the small brass plate on the counter, was Mr. Prescott. He was a man of perhaps 45 with a thin, sharp face and a stained gray vest. And he had the general appearance of someone who had once had ambitions and had long ago put them aside in favor of small, quiet cruelties toward those less powerful than himself. He looked up when she entered. His eyes moved over her from her dusty boots to her sun-browned face, and his mouth pulled into a small, tight, unpleasant smile. "Help you, miss," he said. "I would like to purchase a parcel of land," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was a short, mean laugh, the kind of laugh a man laughs when he is enjoying himself at another person's expense and does not care that they know it. He set down his pen. He stood up. He gestured with a broad, theatrical sweep of his arm at the enormous fly-specked map of the territory that was pinned to the wall behind him. "Well, miss," he said, "we've got quite a selection. Whereabouts had you in mind? Perhaps a nice piece down along the river, or a section up by the mountains with a good view, or perhaps a working ranch already stocked." He was smiling wider now. He was enjoying this. "How much were you thinking of spending?" Ellie set the manila envelope on the counter. She opened it. She counted out the coins and the bills one at a time, and she laid them in a neat stack. $87. Exactly. Mr. Prescott looked at the money. He looked at her. The smile did not entirely leave his face, but it changed. It became a smaller, colder smile. $87, he said. He drew the words out. $87. Well, well, miss, I'm afraid the selection at that price is somewhat limited. In fact, at that price, I'm afraid the selection is essentially the parcels no one else in the territory has been willing to take off our hands. He tapped the map. The good land missed the land with water on it, or grazing or timber, that land is gone. Bought up years ago by men who understood its value. What's left at your price point is mostly well. He made a small, delicate gesture with his hand. Alkali, rock, desert. "I understand," Ellie said. "Do you?" Mr. Prescott said. It was not a question. "Do you truly? Well then, miss, perhaps you'd like to look at what we have." He walked along the counter slowly, letting her wait. He pulled a heavy ledger from a shelf. He set it on the counter and opened it. He turned pages. He hummed a small, tuneless hum. He realized, drawing out the moment. He was going to offer her something worthless, and he was going to enjoy the offering. At last, he stopped on the page. He tapped it with a finger. "Here we are," he said. "Yes, this one might do. Lot 73 Calico Spur Survey, 5 acres, out on the eastern flats along the old rail line. There is a structure on it according to the survey notes. A signal shack. Derelict, of course. The property has been on our books for over 10 years, miss. In all that time, no one has been willing to pay so much as the filing fee to take it off our hands. It is in the professional judgment of this office essentially worthless. But it is available. The price of the deed and the associated filings comes to." He ran his finger down a column. $86.50. He looked up at her. His smile had returned wider than before. He was expecting her to refuse. He was expecting her to protest, to bargain, to walk out. He was expecting at the very least that she would ask a question about the parcel, some small nervous question that would let him tell her in more detail exactly how worthless it was. He was expecting her to give him the satisfaction. She did not give him the satisfaction. She said, "I will take it." The smile faltered. For one small, clean moment, the smile faltered, and Mr. Prescott's face was briefly the face of a man who had been surprised. He recovered. He shrugged elaborately as if to say, "Well, if the young lady insists on being a fool, that was hardly his affair." He pulled a fresh deed form from a drawer. He inked his pen. He began in slow, neat script to fill out the transfer. She watched him write. She watched the pen move. And she noticed, because she was her father's daughter, and she noticed such things, that when Mr. Prescott came to the section of the form that described the boundaries of the parcel, and he had to copy from the surveyor's original the phrase relating to the water rights appurtenant to the property, his hand shook. It was only a small shake. He steadied it at once, and he finished the line, and he moved on. But she had seen it. His hand had shaken. I knew. Whatever it was that lay out there on that lot along the old rusted line of the Calico Spur, Mr. Prescott, the small, mean clerk in the stained vest, knew what it was, or knew enough to be uneasy about selling it, and had done so anyway because he had counted on the buyer being too young and too poor and too much of a girl to ever find out what she was really buying. He slid the completed deed across the counter to her. He held out his hand for the money. She counted out $86.50. She placed the money in his hand. She folded the deed and put it inside her jacket beside her father's map. She picked up the remaining coin, $1/2, and slipped it into her pocket beside the compass. She turned and walked to the door. At the door, she paused. She looked back. "Mr. Prescott," she said. He looked up, warily now. "My father was a cartographer," she said. "He taught me to read what a map is telling me and what a man's hand is telling me. Good afternoon." She stepped out into the hard, bright sunlight of the street. She closed the door behind her. She stood for a moment on the wooden sidewalk, and she took a long, slow breath, and she felt the deed inside her jacket, and the map beside it, and the compass in her pocket, and the $1/2 warm against her thigh. 50 cents in her pocket, 5 acres to her name. A ruin somewhere out along a rusted rail line that led into a country everyone said led nowhere. She turned east. She began to walk. She walked out of Purgatory Springs that same afternoon. She had considered staying the night. She had considered spending some part of her $1/2 on a plate of hot food at the small chop house next to the livery, and perhaps a mattress and a roof, and one night of sleeping under something other than the open sky. She stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, weighing it. And then she walked past the chop house, and past the livery, and past the last false-fronted building in the town, and she stepped down off the boards and onto the hard pan of the eastbound road, and she turned her face into the sun. She was not a woman who trusted comfort. 13 years in a line shack had taught her that comfort was a thing borrowed on short terms and always repaid at interest, and that a person who owned nothing was safest when she needed nothing. She still had $87 of value in the world. It was 5 acres of desert in a piece of paper. It was less than most, but it was hers, and she wanted to stand on it before the sun set on another day of her life. The rusted rails of the Calico Spur ran a quarter-mile south of the road, and she cut across the sage to meet them. She walked between them on the wooden ties, matching her stride to the spacing, the way she had learned to do as a girl, walking behind her father on the survey line. The ties were sun-cracked and gray. Weeds pushed up through the ballast. In places, the iron had heaved and settled, and the rails ran wavy and out of true like a line drawn by a hand that had begun to shake at the end. But they ran east, and they ran so far as her father's map was concerned, straight toward the small red circle he had drawn for her 13 years ago in the light of his workshop lamp. She walked until the sun set behind her and threw her long, thin shadow ahead of her along the ties. She walked until the desert cooled and the stars began to come out one by one. She walked until her legs were shaking with the effort, and then she stepped off the ties and made a small camp in the lee of a creosote bush. And she ate a strip of jerky and drank a single measured swallow of water, and she lay down on her wool blanket and she looked up at the sky. The stars over the Sonora Flats in the year 1902 were something a modern person can no longer easily imagine. There was no light from any town within 30 miles. There was no glow on any horizon. The sky was black, and the stars were not scattered on it, but sunk into it, layer on layer of them, down and down, until it seemed you could fall upward into them if you were not careful. Her father had once told her that the ancients believed the stars were the lanterns of the dead, held up by those who had gone before to guide the living home. He had said he did not know if this was true, but that he liked to think of it that way. She thought of it that way now. She found the North Star. She found Polaris, the one that held. She looked at it for a long time, and she felt her father's hand on her shoulder, the way she had felt it 1,000 times when he had carried her out into the yard to name the constellations. And she closed her eyes, and she slept. She woke before dawn. She drank another measured swallow of water. She rolled her blanket. She started walking again while the eastern sky was still the color of an old bruise. She walked all through the cool of the early morning, and she rested in the shade of a red rock outcropping through the worst of the noon heat, and she walked again through the long, slanting light of the afternoon, and by the time the second sunset came, she had covered by her own reckoning some 20 miles. On the map her father had drawn, the small red circle sat perhaps 25 miles east of Purgatory Springs, which meant that on the morning of the third day, if she rose early and walked steady, she would come to it. She did rise early. She did walk steady. And on the morning of the third day, at a little past 9 o'clock, when the sun had climbed well above the horizon behind her and the shadows had shortened around her feet, she crested a low rise in the flats and she stopped walking. She stopped walking because she had seen it. It stood some 3/4 of a mile ahead of her alone in the middle of a wide flat pan of red earth, and it was so large and so wrong for the country around it that for one long moment her mind refused to process what her eyes were showing her. She stood on the rise and stared. She did not move. She did not speak. The wind lifted the hem of her dress and dropped it again. A hawk turned in the sky above her and cried once thin and far. It was a water tower. But to say only that it was a water tower is to say nothing at all. This was not the small wooden trackside tank a person might see at a whistle stop in the plains country, the kind with the sagging plank sides and the tin spout that the fireman swung down over the tender when the locomotive drew up under it. This was a monster. This was a work. This was a cathedral of iron standing alone in a landscape that had no cathedral and no need of one. It was, she guessed later, when she had learned to measure such things, some 60 feet tall from the ground to the peak of its conical roof. The main tank was a great round cylinder of riveted cast iron plates, black once, and now weeping long streaks of red rust down its sides, like a face that had wept and never wiped itself clean. The tank sat on 4 immense iron legs, each leg a lattice of cross girders bolted together at intervals with rivets the size of a man's fist. The legs splayed slightly outward at the base and were set into square concrete pads sunk deep into the desert floor. Between the legs and the shadow of the tank ran a network of pipes and a great iron ladder that climbed all the way to a small railed platform circling the top. There was a spout folded back against the tank like the arm of a sleeping thing, and a long-handled cast counterweight hanging from a chain ready to swing the spout outward and down over a train that had not passed in 20 years. And painted on the flank of the tank in tall block letters that the desert sun had faded from black to the color of dried blood were the words she could just make out from the rise where she stood. Calico Spur Railway Co. And below that smaller, 1876, she stood on the rise for a long time. The wind blew steadily out of the south, and it moved through the lattice of the iron legs with a low humming sigh, the way wind moves through the strings of a piano when the lid has been left open. The tower was so out of scale with the flat, empty country around it that it seemed almost to be floating. It seemed almost to have been dropped there by a hand from the sky and forgotten. There was nothing else. No town, no road, no fence. Nothing but the tower and the two thin rusted lines of the spur running past it, and off to one side, tiny and cowering in the enormous shadow of the great iron thing, a small dark shape that she took after a moment to be a building. A shack. Her shack. She began slowly to walk down the rise toward it. The closer she came, the larger the tower grew. It is one thing to see such a structure from 3/4 of a mile off standing on the horizon like a distant idea. It is another thing entirely to walk beneath it. When she came at last to stand at the base of one of the four great iron legs, she had to tip her head back so far to see the peak of the roof that she nearly lost her balance. The tank blotted out a large piece of the sky. The rivets seen from this close were the size of her fist, and each one had a small ring of rust bleeding out from around it, so that the whole tank was patterned with dark red circles like an old smallpox. The iron of the legs was pitted and rough with age, but still solid, still standing. Still she guessed with the small survey-trained part of her mind that her father had planted there long ago, likely to stand for another 100 years without falling. It had been made to last in the days when men built things to last. And the desert had done what the desert does to iron, which was to touch it lightly and let it be. She put her hand flat against one of the great iron legs. The metal was warm from the morning sun. She could feel faintly a vibration in it, the low, continuous singing of the wind through all the miles of pipe and rivet and girder above her. It was like standing with her hand on the flank of some enormous sleeping animal that was breathing in and out around her. She stood there for a long moment, and then she remembered her father. She remembered him tracing his finger along the fine ink line of the calico spur on the map spread out on the workshop floor. She remembered him saying in his low, unhurried voice, "No one lays a rail to nowhere, Ellie. They were always going somewhere." She remembered the small red circle he had drawn and the three careful words he had written beside it. For Ellie, when she is ready. He had known about this tower. He had known somehow that it stood out here in this forgotten country and that it was going to matter. Perhaps he had surveyed it himself all those years ago when the Calico Spur was still a going concern. Perhaps he had stood right here where she was standing now with his hand on this same iron leg and had thought of the small daughter waiting for him at home in Willow Bend and had decided quietly that he would keep the knowledge of this place for her. She took her hand off the leg. She wiped her palm against her dress. She walked out from under the tower and around to the shack. The shack was indeed a ruin. It was a small structure, no more than 12 feet by 10, built from railroad ties and salvaged planks, and it listed to one side as if the desert had been slowly pushing at it for 20 years and had grown almost tired of pushing. The roof was a patchwork of rusted tin and open rafters. The door hung from a single leather hinge, and the single window was a jagged, empty square with the last teeth of glass still clinging to the frame. Inside the floor was packed earth drifted with sand and littered with the small skeletons of things that had crawled in to die out of the sun. But at the eastern end of the shack, taking up nearly the whole of that wall, stood a fireplace. And the fireplace, unlike the rest of the shack, was solid. It was built of dry stacked riverstone, mortared with red clay, its chimney rising straight and true through a hole in the roof. It was blackened with the soot of 10,000 small fires. It was the one thing in that whole ruin that looked as if it had been built by a person who had loved the place and had meant to stay. Ellie stood in the doorway and looked at that fireplace for a long moment, and then she smiled for perhaps the first time in a week. A small smile private meant for no one. She set down her canvas sack. She untied her jacket. She rolled up her sleeves, and she got to work. That first night when the sun had set and the wind had gone soft, and the stars had come out over the great flat pan of the desert, Ellie sat cross-legged on her wool blanket inside the shack with her father's compass in one hand and Hannah's dried rose petal in the other. She had not built a fire because she did not yet trust the chimney to draw without inspection and because the night was warm. She had eaten a piece of jerky and drunk a swallow of water. She had propped the broken door against the frame so that only the smallest gap remained. She sat there for a long time. She listened to the wind moving through the iron legs of the tower above her, and she looked up through the open rafters at the black sky and the deep sunk stars. And she thought not for the first time and not for the last that a person could belong to a place before that place belonged to her. She held the small dried petal in her palm, and she remembered Hannah on the stump behind the smokehouse, and she remembered her mother's face for a moment, just for a moment more clearly than she had remembered it in years, and she closed her hand gently over the petal, and she said quietly to nobody, "All right then." That was all she said. But when at last she lay down on her blanket and closed her eyes, she slept without dreaming, and she slept the whole long, clean sleep of a person who had at last arrived somewhere. For the first 3 days, she did nothing but clean. She fashioned a broom from a creosote branch and swept out the years of accumulated sand and dust and animal leavings. She pulled the rotten planks from the roof and let the desert sun pour in, and she said aloud to no one, "Let the sun cook you clean," which was something Hannah Doyle used to say about a soiled kitchen. She hauled buckets of water from a small seep she had found a quarter-mile to the south in a low place where the desert had improbably and generously allowed a thin thread of moisture to come to the surface. She washed the walls. She washed the stones of the fireplace. She washed her own hands and face and hair for the first time in a week, and she felt herself becoming once again a person and not a stray creature moving across a landscape. On the fourth day, she started on the hearth itself. The firebox was choked with old ash packed down by 20 years of moisture and settling into a hard gray crust that had almost the consistency of stone. She chipped at it with the blade of her hatchet, working slowly, patiently, the way Cyrus Bell had taught her to work at any job that was going to take longer than an hour. She scraped down through the old ash to the base of the firebox. She uncovered layer by layer the smoke-blackened river stones that formed the sides. And when at last she had cleared the whole firebox to its floor, she found herself looking at a single flat slab of pale sandstone, easily 2 feet square, that lay as the hearthstone of the whole fireplace. She sat back on her heels. She looked at that slab. It was different from the other stones. That was the first thing that struck her. The other stones of the fireplace were the rounded gray and red cobbles of a desert wash, weathered smooth by centuries of flash flood. The hearthstone was cut. It was not a round stone. It was a squared block of buff sandstone quarried from some other place, brought in and set deliberately. And it did not sit in mortar the way the other stones did. It sat in a bed of loose, dry sand. Her father's voice came back to her from somewhere very far away. If you look closely enough, the land will always tell you its story. If you look closely enough. She looked closely. She traced the edge of the slab with the tip of her knife. She found at one corner a small gap where the sand had settled away from the stone. She wedged her knife into the gap. She pried gently. The slab moved. It moved not by much, but it moved. It shifted on its bed of sand with the faintest whisper, the way a lid shifts on a well-made box. Her heart, which had been beating a slow, patient rhythm for days, gave one small, clear thump against her ribs. She fetched the sturdy iron pry bar she had bought in Purgatory Springs. She worked the flat end into the gap. She leaned on it. The slab lifted, tipped, and with a slow, grating groan of stone against stone, it came up onto its edge. She caught it before it could topple. She walked it hand over to the wall, and she leaned it there gently. Then she went back to the fireplace, and she knelt down and she looked into the hollow beneath. It was a small excavation in the earth, perhaps 8 inches deep, perhaps a foot square, its walls squared and neat, its floor tamped hard. And resting in the exact center of that small hollow, wrapped tightly in a sheath of oiled canvas that had darkened to a rich tobacco brown. With the passage of years was a rectangular tin box about the size of a loaf of bread. She lifted it out with both hands. It was heavy, heavier than she had expected. She carried it to the small pine board she had set up as a table by the window, and she laid it there in the pool of morning light, and she sat down on the empty crate she had been using as a stool, and she stared at it. For a long moment she did not open it. She simply looked. She thought of the person who had wrapped this canvas and set this box in this hollow and laid this hearthstone back over it. She thought of the hands that had done that work. She thought of the reason a person does such a thing. A person hides a box in a hearth because they mean to come back for it, or because they cannot take it with them, or because they wish it to be found in time by someone who might need it. She unwrapped the canvas slowly, its old folds cracking softly under her fingers. The tin box beneath was plain of the sort that had once held tea or ship's biscuit. Its clasp was a simple hook. She lifted the hook. She raised the lid. The contents had been packed with an extraordinary neatness, as if by a person who had believed that neatness was itself a form of respect toward whoever would one day find them. The topmost object was small and dark and lay wrapped in a scrap of soft flannel. She lifted it out. She unwrapped it in her palm. It was a wooden bird, a finch, she thought, or perhaps a sparrow, no more than 2 inches long from beak to tail, carved from a single piece of dark walnut. Its lines were simple, worn smooth by the polishing of many years of a hand that had turned it and turned it. There was a small chip out of one wing where the wood had once caught against something and split. It had been mended with a drop of pitch and left to be as it was. She held that little bird for a long moment in her open palm. She did not know why it moved her. She had not yet read a single word of what lay beneath it. And yet the small dark shape of it in her hand, the patience of the carving, the mended wing, the sense of a stranger's love pressed into the wood over long, slow years, made her throat close, and made her eyes burn, and made her set the bird gently down on the pine board before she could disgrace herself by weeping over a piece of carved walnut belonging to a person she had never met. She looked back into the box. The next layer was paper, a folded letter, its cream-colored sheet gone yellow at the edges, its wax seal long since broken, its careful, precise script showing through the fold. She lifted it out and set it beside the bird. She did not open it yet. Some things you save. The next layer was oilcloth tied with twine dense and heavy. She lifted this out as well. She untied the twine. She unfolded the oilcloth, and she looked down at a tight, neat stack of coins and bills. She counted them slowly, laying each piece out in a row on the pine board. $20 gold pieces gleaming softly, 12 of them. $10 gold pieces, 6 of them. And a folded sheaf of territorial banknotes, crisp still despite the years which added up when she had counted them twice, to be sure to $130. She totaled the whole in her head. $430. $430. She sat back. She looked at the money in the light. She thought of the $87 her uncle had counted out into her palm, and she thought of the mocking laugh of Mr. Prescott, the land clerk, and she thought of the small, quiet stranger who had set this box in this hearth as if she had known that someone would need it, and she almost laughed. Almost, not yet. Because at the bottom of the box, beneath where the oilcloth bundle had lain there, was one more thing, a single sheet of heavy paper folded once. She lifted it out. She unfolded it. She read. It was a document. It was a legal instrument drafted in the flowing formal hand of a territorial clerk of the year 1868, its top edge stamped with the embossed seal of the Territorial Water Commission. It was a certificate of water rights. It granted to the holder of the document in perpetuity the exclusive appurtenant rights to the aquifer designated, Underlying Section 14, Township 6, South Range 22 East, being the aquifer commonly known as the Calico Basin and encompassing all groundwater within its bounds, together with the surface access thereto by the standing water tower located on the said section. She read it twice. She read it 3 times. She sat very still, holding the paper in both hands, and she felt the small pieces of a large picture beginning to settle into their proper places in her mind. The tower was not an abandoned railway relic. It was, or it had been, the standing intake for a working aquifer, the Calico Basin. She had heard the name before. She had heard it, in fact, 3 weeks ago on the wind from her uncle's office in the cultured voice of a well-dressed Eastern stranger. Water rights, the man had said. The Calico. It would be tidied up in a matter of months, and no one would be the wiser. She looked out the window at the great iron shape of the tower standing black against the pale sky. She looked back at the paper in her hands. She looked for a long moment at the small carved wooden bird. Then very carefully she set the water rights certificate aside. She picked up the letter. She broke the last remnant of the wax seal, which she had not disturbed until now, and she unfolded the paper and she began to read. To the person who finds this place, the letter began in a hand as precise and unhurried as her father's had been. My name is Cora Hollister. I lived in this shack for 17 years, from 1868 to 1885, together with my husband, Nathaniel. Nathaniel was a signalman for the Calico Spur Railway, and this was his post. He tended the tower and the switch and the lantern, and he kept the line open in the years when the line was still open. In the summer of 1878, he was killed in an accident on the trestle above the North Wash, which was a hard blow, but not at my age an unfamiliar one. I remained here after him for another 7 years. This was our home. We were given the water rights to the Calico Basin in 1868 by the railway company in lieu of the wages Nathaniel was owed at the time the company reorganized. The lawyers assured us the paper was worthless. They were wrong. The paper is not worthless. The paper is in fact the most valuable thing I have ever held. But it was valuable only so long as no one else knew of it, and so we spoke of it to no one. And we lived quietly, and Nathaniel drew water from the basin for the trains that passed, and I traded eggs and mended shirts to the folks who lived further along this line, and we made a small life. It was enough for us. I am leaving the paper here because I have no one else to give it to. Our only son Wesley went east to find work in 1879. He was 19 years old, the same age I imagine you may be, whoever you are reading this now. He wrote to me from St. Louis and from Cincinnati and from Philadelphia for 2 years. Then his letters stopped. It has been 6 years since I have had any word of him. I have written to the last address he gave me, and my letters have come back marked no such person. I do not know if my boy is dead or alive. I have prayed both prayers that he is alive somewhere and does not know how to come home, and that he is at rest and beyond the reach of harm. I do not know which prayer God has answered. I hope one day to find out. I am an old woman now. I am going to live with my sister in Tucson because I cannot manage this country alone any longer, and because there is a small pension in the offer that I cannot refuse. I do not think I will see this desert again. It has been my home and I love it, but the body is what the body is, and the body is going. I am leaving the money because I saved it against the day my boy came home, and my boy has not come home. Use it to build something. There is good stone in the creek bed 1 mile south, and the clay by the wash makes a fine mortar. Beware the summer storms. They come up fast from the south. I am leaving the water paper because you will need it more than I will. I do not know who you are. I only know that no one comes to the Calico Spur by accident, and that if you have found this box, you have followed the line for reasons of your own. Take the paper, take the water, guard it well. There are men in this territory who know what the Calico Basin is worth and who have been trying for 20 years to determine who holds it. They are patient men. They will not stop looking. Do not on any account let them know what you have. 5 miles east of here, along the tracks, there is a canyon. The tracks curve into it. Follow them. In the canyon, there is a settlement called Calico Wash. It is not on any map. The people there are good people. Their grandfathers were mining families out of Boston and Baltimore who were swindled out of their claims in the year 1861 by a syndicate whose name you would recognize if I named it, though I will not name it here. Rather than scatter, they retreated into the canyon and made a life. They drew water from the Calico Basin by an old arrangement with my Nathaniel, and they have drawn it ever since. If you go to them, tell them Cora sent you. Tell them the water is yours now, and you mean to honor the arrangement. They will understand. They will help you. If you find my son, tell him his mother waited. That is all I have. Cora Hollister, 1885. Ellie read the letter. Cora Hollister, 1885. Ellie read the letter 3 times. She read it slowly. She read the last 3 sentences 4 times. By the third reading, the light coming through the small window of the shack had shifted and gone soft, and her cheeks were wet, and she did not remember starting to weep. She was not weeping for herself. She was weeping for a woman she had never met, who had sat in this same room in the last hours of her time in it, and had folded a piece of paper and written on it the whole shape of a life, and had left it for a stranger. She held the small wooden finch in her palm again. She understood now what the bird had meant. Wesley had carved it. Wesley, her son. Some winter when he was a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, home from the schoolhouse, sitting by this hearth with a piece of walnut and a pocket knife. He had made it for his mother, and his mother had carried it in her apron pocket for 30 years through the death of her husband and the loss of her boy and the slow, long silence of a life at the end of a rail line to nowhere. And she had left it here in the box on top of the money and the letter and the water rights because it was the thing she loved most. And because she had known that whoever found the box would need to know, first of all, that she had loved. Ellie closed the letter. She folded it. She set it back in the tin box. She set the wooden finch beside it. She left the water rights out on the pine board in the pool of afternoon light because she wanted to look at it a little longer. Then she stood up. She walked to the door of the shack. She stepped out into the yard and she looked up at the great iron tower standing above her 60 feet of black weeping metal against the deep blue sky. And she said quietly aloud to no one who could hear her, "All right." She said it again, "All right." She walked to Purgatory Springs the next morning at first light. She walked hard. She was carrying a leather pouch inside her jacket now, in which she had placed $100 in gold pieces. She had left the rest of Cora Hollister's money hidden behind a loose stone in the fireplace, along with the water rights, which she had folded into the oilcloth and tied with twine. She had left the wooden finch on the pine board by the window, where the morning sun would find it first when it rose. She reached the town by late afternoon. She went first to the mercantile. The mercantile owner was a Mr. Halloran, a stout, florid man with a great mustache and the shrewd, sharp eyes of a merchant who had learned over long years to size up a customer's purse in the first 3 seconds of the encounter. When Ellie had come through his door 2 days ago on her walk out to the flats, he had barely looked up from his ledger. Now when she came through the door again, dusty and sunbrown, and asking for a full list of tools and lumber and provisions, he set down his pen and gave her his full attention. And when she paid for the first small purchase with a $20 gold piece, his attention became something considerably more like respect. She spent 3 hours in that store. She bought a good cross-cut saw and a heavy claw hammer and a brace and bit set and boxes of 8-penny and 16-penny nails. She bought a bundle of milled pine boards for a proper floor and a stack of new pine planks for roof decking and 3 rolls of tar paper. She bought a small, sturdy cast-iron stove with a length of pipe. She bought sacks of flour and beans and salt and coffee and a slab of bacon wrapped in butcher paper. She bought a new kerosene lamp and a tin of oil. She bought a proper axe and a good shovel and a hand drill and a set of files. She bought 2 sturdy blankets and a proper cot with a canvas top and a small enamel wash basin. She bought a woman's leather work belt with pouches for tools. She bought a folding pocket knife of good steel, which she chose because it reminded her of one Cyrus Bell had carried. She paid for all of it in gold coin by coin laid neat on the counter. Mr. Halloran counted her purchases twice. He wrote out the receipt in a fine copperplate hand. He said, "Where shall I deliver, miss?" And Ellie said, I will need a freighter. Would you recommend one? He recommended Hank Bradley at the livery. She was still standing at Mr. Halloran's counter tying the strings of her new leather work belt when the bell over the door jangled and a man stepped in behind her. She did not look at him at first. Mr. Halloran did. Mr. Halloran's face did something small and interesting when he saw who had come in. He straightened a fraction. He set down her receipt. He said in a voice that had suddenly acquired a certain professional warmth, Mr. Vance, good afternoon, sir. Ellie went still. She did not turn around, but her hands working at the belt strings went slower and slower until they stopped. The voice behind her said, Afternoon, Halloran, fine day. It was a cultured voice. It was a low voice. It had the flat, clipped cadence of the East. It was the voice she had heard on the wind 3 weeks ago from her uncle's office. It was the voice that had said so calmly, so pleasantly, that 19-year-old girls came to grief in the Sonora Flats every summer. She turned around slowly. She turned around because she had decided in the space of the 2 heartbeats it took to turn that she would rather see this man's face than have him see the back of her head one moment longer. I was perhaps 45 years old. He was well dressed. He wore a dark broadcloth suit cut close to the body in the Eastern style and a small dove-gray waistcoat with a heavy gold watch chain crossing it. His boots were polished. His hat was in his hand. His face was long and clean-shaven and pleasant, with the sort of pleasant expression that a certain kind of professional man wears, the way another man wears a shirt, which is to say, over whatever it is he actually is. His eyes were pale gray. They moved over her briefly and did not settle. He did not recognize her. He had never seen her. He had only spoken about her in a distant room as a small piece of business that would be tidied up in a matter of months. Miss, he said, and inclined his head and stepped past her toward the counter. She said nothing. She finished tying her belt. She picked up her receipt from the counter. She thanked Mr. Halloran. She walked out. She stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the mercantile for a full minute. She breathed. She counted in her head backward from 10 the way her father had once taught her to do when she was frightened because a person who is counting cannot also be panicking, and the counting will hold the panic off long enough for the good work of the mind to resume. When she reached 1, she walked to the livery to find Hank Bradley. Hank Bradley was mending a harness in the small tack room at the back of the livery when she came in. He was a man of perhaps 62, with a face weathered the color of an old saddle and hands so thick and calloused that they looked as if they had been carved from the same hickory as the harness pegs. He wore a shapeless felt hat and a heavy canvas coat despite the warmth of the day. He looked up when she entered, and he said nothing, and he waited. She stated her business. She named the load. She named the destination. She named her price. He looked at her for a long time. He looked at her small frame and her worn dress under the new work belt and the $20 gold piece she had laid on the workbench as a deposit. He spat delicately into a tin can beside his stool. That's a lot of lumber for a girl on her own, he said. His voice was a low gravel rumble. I have work to do, Mr. Bradley, she said. And the Calico Spur is a rough track, he said. I have walked it 3 times, Mr. Bradley, she said. I know what it is. He looked at her again, longer. Something in his face did a small, quiet thing that might in another man have passed for a smile. He picked up the gold piece. He weighed it in his palm. He put it in his pocket. Be ready at sunup, he said. They rode out at sunup. Hank Bradley's wagon was an old freight wagon with iron rim wheels and a team of 4 heavy mules, and it groaned under the weight of the lumber and the stove and the sacks. Ellie sat on the box beside Hank with her canvas sack on her lap and her father's compass in her pocket. They did not speak much on the ride out. Now and then Hank would nod at some feature of the country and say the name of it, and she would nod back, and that was all. She saw, watching her. He was reading her the way she had learned to read the land. She let him read. When they came up over the last rise and the great iron tower rose into view against the pale morning sky, Hank Bradley stopped the mules. He sat for a long moment. He tipped his hat back on his head. Well, he said, I'll be a son of a gun. That was all he said. They unloaded together through the long, slanting light of the afternoon. Hank was strong in the deep, patient way of an older man who has never stopped working, and he moved the heavy timbers as if they were nothing. When it was done, the whole of Ellie's future stood in a neat, orderly pile in the shade of the tower's four great iron legs. Before he climbed back onto the wagon, Hank walked around the little shack, once slowly looking at it. He looked at the fireplace. He looked at the sagging roof. He looked up at the tower. "You'll want to set your main roof beam first," he said without looking at her. "Anchor it to the chimney stack. It's the solidest thing you've got." "Thank you, Mr. Bradley," she said. He touched his hat brim. He climbed onto the wagon. He turned the team. And as the wagon began to roll away toward the western horizon, he called back to her over his shoulder without turning around one more thing. "There's a man in town by the name of Vance," he said. "Fella from Boston. Sniffs around the land office a good deal. If he comes out this way, miss, don't you take him at his face. You mind me?" He did not wait for her to answer. He clucked to the mules. The wagon rolled on. She stood there until it was a small dark shape on the horizon, and then a smaller shape, and then nothing at all. Then she turned back to the shack, in the tower, in the great pile of her new life stacked in the iron shade, and she got to work. She worked for 2 weeks. She worked from sunup to sundown, and by the light of her new kerosene lamp for an hour or two after that. And she slept on her canvas cot in the middle of the packed earth floor of the shack, because there was nowhere else yet to sleep. She laid a proper floor of milled pine board by board, hammered flat and true. She built new rafters following the shape of the old ones, but true this time, and set them into the notches she cut in the top of the wall plates. She set the main roof beam first, as Hank Bradley had told her, to anchor to the stone chimney stack, and from that anchor she built out the rest of the roof. She decked it with new pine and papered it with tar paper. She hung a new door on new iron hinges she bought in her second trip to Purgatory Springs. She glazed the window with a new pane and shuttered it and hung a curtain of unbleached muslin. She set the little cast iron stove into a corner and ran the pipe up through the roof and flashed it against the weather. She built herself a small pine table and a stool and a shelf for her books, of which she owned none yet, but meant to. The shack at the end of those 2 weeks was no longer a ruin. It was a small, warm, functional home. It was still small. It was still, when seen against the great looming shape of the water tower above it, tiny to the point of comedy. But it was clean, and it was tight, and it held her, and it was hers. She had not yet gone to Calico Wash. She had put off that walk for as long as she could, reasonably put it off because she was not yet sure what she would say when she got there. She was carrying now a paper that Cora Hollister had said would matter to the people who lived in that canyon. She was carrying the news, whether they knew it yet or not, that the strangers of their old arrangement had all died or moved on, and that the water they depended on was now, by every law of the territory, the property of a 19-year-old girl whose name they did not know. But the walk had to be walked. On the morning of the 15th day, she rose before dawn. She put on her work belt with a full water skin and a strip of jerky and her folded pocket knife. She placed the water right certificate inside her jacket over her heart folded flat. She banked the stove. She latched the door of the shack behind her. She stood for a long moment beneath the iron tower looking up, and then she turned east and began to walk along the rusted rails. 5 miles, Cora Hollister's letter had said. She walked them at a steady pace through the cool of the early morning. The tracks ran straight and true across the flat pan of the desert for the first 3 miles, and then, as Cora had promised, they began to curve. The flat country gave way to low rocky mesas. The rails ran between two rising walls of red rock, and the walls came in closer as she walked, and the air grew cooler in the shade of them, and then quite suddenly the tracks bent hard to the north and disappeared into a narrow cut in the rock, so narrow that she had to walk single file between the rails to enter it. She walked into the cut. She walked along it for perhaps a quarter mile, the walls rising 40 and 50 feet above her, on either side the sky, a thin blue ribbon overhead. And then the walls fell away, and the tracks opened into a small circular valley, and she stopped and she stared. There was a creek. There were cottonwoods, tall and green and moving in the small wind. There were adobe houses, perhaps a dozen of them, low and neat, and washed pale in the morning sun, each with a plot of green garden behind it. There was smoke rising from three chimneys. There were goats in a small pen behind one of the houses, and a rooster crowing somewhere out of sight, and the distant steady ring of a blacksmith's hammer on iron. It was a small hidden town cupped in the palm of the rock like a secret and green with life, in the middle of a country where nothing green had any business being. A man was working in the nearest garden. He straightened when he saw her, and he stood very still. Then he called out without taking his eyes off her a single word she could not quite hear, and doors began to open. People came out onto the small clay porches of the houses. 6, 8, 12 of them, ranged in age from a young man with a hoe to an old woman leaning on a cane. They did not come toward her. They stood on their porches. They watched her. She walked forward slowly. She kept her hands in plain sight. She stopped some 15 feet from the nearest house, and she waited. The old woman with the cane stepped down off her porch. She was perhaps 70 years old. Her hair was iron gray, worn in a single long braid down her back. Her face was mapped with the fine, deep wrinkles of a person who had spent her whole life squinting into the desert sun, and her eyes under the wrinkles were of a startling pale blue, and they were sharp as a hawk's. She wore a long gray dress and a shawl of undyed wool, and a pair of small silver earrings that caught the light. She walked with the cane, but she did not seem to lean on it. She stopped a few paces in front of Ellie. She looked her up and down. "State your business, child," she said. Her voice was calm and clear. Ellie said, "My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I have taken ownership of the signal shack down the line at the tower. In cleaning the hearth, I found a letter. The letter was from a woman named Cora Hollister. She told me I might find this place. She said to tell you that Cora sent me." She stopped. She did not say more. She had learned in Warren Whitfield's office that the shorter a statement, the harder it was for the listener to twist. The old woman looked at her for a long moment. Something in her face, which had been closed and watchful, softened by a small increment. She did not smile. She simply released by a little whatever guard she had been holding. "I am Winifred Ashby," she said. "I remember Cora. She was a good woman. Quiet. She traded with us for many years after Nathaniel died. Come sit, child. You have walked a long way." She led Ellie to a small covered bench beside her house. She sent a young girl for water. She sat down on the bench beside her, and she folded her old hands in her lap, and she said, "Now, tell it plain, all of it." And Ellie, sitting under the cottonwoods in the small hidden town at the end of the rusted line that everyone said led nowhere, told it plain. She told about her uncle and the $87, and the walk east, and Mr. Prescott, the clerk, and the deed. She told about the tower and the shack, and the hearthstone and the box. She did not at first mention the water rights. She was watching Winifred Ashby's face. She was learning it. When she had finished the first part of the story, Winifred nodded once slowly. "You had best come to the fire tonight, child," she said. "There are things you should know, and there are things I expect that we should know as well." That evening, after the sun had set and the small valley had cooled, and the stars had begun to come out over the narrow ribbon of sky, between the canyon walls, the people of Calico Wash gathered in a low adobe hall at the center of the settlement around a small fire and a central hearth. There were perhaps 30 of them in all, old and young. They sat on benches along the walls. They watched Ellie with careful, patient eyes. Winifred Ashby told her the history first. She told it plain as she had asked Ellie to tell hers. The people of Calico Wash were the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of 31 families, mostly Scottish and English out of Boston, and some German out of Baltimore, who had come west in the years before the war to work small silver claims in the hills above what was now the Calico Spur. In the year 1861, a syndicate of Eastern investors operating through a chain of local agents and corrupt clerks had swindled every one of those 31 families out of their claims by means of falsified filings, forged deeds, and in 3 cases hired violence, rather than scatter to the four winds and be broken piecemeal. The families had made a decision. They had loaded what they could carry into wagons, and they had ridden into this canyon, which one of their old prospectors had known of and had judged unlikely to be searched, and they had built a life. They had erased their own names from the county rolls. They had ceased for all official purposes to exist. That had been 41 years ago. They had lived here since. They had children born in this canyon who had never once set foot in a town. They wanted nothing from the outside world. They wanted only to be left in peace. There was one thing, however, they could not do without. That was water. And the water they used, the water that ran in the small clear creek that came into the canyon from the northwest, was the surface expression of the same aquifer that lay beneath the Calico Basin. It was the same water that fed the Standing Tower. In the year 1870, Nathaniel Hollister had come to Winifred Ashby's father, who had been the elder of Calico Wash at that time, and had told him quietly that he held the paper on that basin, and that the paper meant that no one else could touch the water without his consent, and that they were welcome to it for as long as they needed it, at no cost, on the single condition that they never speak of the arrangement to anyone outside the canyon. Her father had accepted. Nathaniel had died. Cora had honored the arrangement for another 7 years. Then Cora had gone to Tucson, and for 17 years, the arrangement had been maintained by nothing but silence and old habit, and the fact that no one in the outside world had ever known to look. Winifred looked at Ellie across the low fire. Her pale blue eyes were very steady. "And now," she said, "the paper is yours." Ellie reached inside her jacket. She drew out the folded water rights certificate. She unfolded it. She held it up in the firelight so that all of them could see it. Then she laid it flat on her knee. "I will honor the arrangement," she said. She said it clear. She said it once. "For as long as I hold this paper, the water is yours as it was before." She did not say more. She had been raised in a house where words were spent as coin and never wasted. There was a silence in the hall. It was not a hostile silence. It was the silence of a group of people receiving a piece of news that changed a great many things and choosing not to speak until they had felt the change settle. The blacksmith broke it. He was a big man, perhaps 40 years old, with hair the color of wheat and heavy shoulders under his leather apron. He had been sitting at the back of the hall, and Ellie had not particularly noticed him. He stood up now. He walked forward. He stopped a few paces from her. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she could not read. "Miss Whitfield," he said. His voice was low. "My name is Ezra Kane. I am the smith here. If you will bring me your tools when you have a chance, I will put a proper edge on every one of them. It's the least a man can do for a person who keeps her word." He inclined his head briefly and walked back to his bench. Ellie folded the water rights and put it back inside her jacket. She walked home late that night under the cold, clear stars along the rusted rails. When she came up over the last low rise, and the great iron tower rose again into view against the sky, 60 feet of black metal standing alone in the desert, she stopped and looked at it for a long time. The wind moved through the lattice of its 4 great legs with the same low humming sigh. The rivets caught the starlight. The faded letters on the flank of the tank were invisible in the dark, but she knew what they said. Calico Spur Railway, Cumbermer, 1876. She walked down to the shack. She stood beneath the tower. She put her hand flat against one of the great iron legs as she had on the first morning. The metal was cool now in the night air, and it hummed faintly under her palm. She thought of 30 families in a canyon. She thought of a small wooden bird in a tin box. She thought of a paper folded over her heart. She thought of a well-dressed man from Boston stepping into a mercantile in a small dusty town, and of the way his pale gray eyes had passed across her face without recognizing her, and of the way one day soon they would recognize her and would not be pleased. She took her hand off the leg. She walked into her shack. She latched the door. She lit her lamp. She sat down at her small pine table, and she opened the tin box, and she took out the small carved wooden finch, and she set it on the table in the pool of lamplight. "All right, Cora," she said quietly to no one who could hear her. "All right." Then she blew out the lamp and she lay down on her cot, and she listened to the wind singing through the iron legs of the tower above her, and she waited for the morning. The trouble did not come for her at once. That was the strange grace of those first weeks after Calico Wash. She had walked into that hidden canyon carrying a paper folded over her heart, and she had walked out again with an arrangement kept and a name spoken over her. And for 11 days after that meeting, nothing came to disturb the small world she had begun to build under the great iron shadow of the tower. She woke with the sun each morning. She banked her stove. She drew water from the seep to the south. She worked on the shack, adding small things, now things that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with living. She built a proper doorstep out of 2 flat stones set into the ground. She planted a hedge of yucca along the west wall to break the wind. She hung a length of clothesline between 2 of the tower's iron legs, and when she washed her one spare dress and pinned it to that line to dry the wind through the lattice above her, made the dress dance in a slow, steady rhythm that was almost like being watched over. Ezra Kane came out once on the 4th morning after the meeting in the hall riding a small, tough gray mule. He had brought her tools with him, every one sharpened to an edge that would part a hair. He set them on her small pine table without ceremony. He drank a cup of coffee at her stove. He looked at the roof she had put on, and he ran his hand along the main beam where it anchored to the chimney stone, and he nodded once. He asked in his low, quiet voice whether she would like him to build her a proper pump handle for the seep so that she would not have to lower a bucket by rope. She said she would. He said he would bring one at the end of the week. He drank the rest of his coffee. He touched his hat brim. He climbed back on the mule and rode away. He did bring the pump handle at the end of that week. He installed it himself, working through the long, slanting light of an afternoon, with Ellie holding the wrench when he asked her to, and passing him the buckets of clay for the seal. He said very little while he worked. She noticed that his hands were remarkable. They were the hands of a man who had spent 30 years making iron do what he asked of it, and yet they moved with a strange delicacy, the way the hands of a musician move over an instrument. When the work was done and the pump was primed and the first small stream of cool water came up from the seep at the pull of the handle, he stood back and looked at it and gave one short nod of satisfaction. And Ellie thought, watching him, that he was the kind of man who had learned somewhere along the way to take pleasure in a task done well, because he had learned somewhere along the way that not much else in the world was reliable. She did not know yet what she would come to know later about him. But she noticed that afternoon the shape of the shadow he cast when he stood with his back to the setting sun. And she noticed that his shoulders looked from a certain angle the way a boy's shoulders might look if you added 30 years of grief to them. And she noticed, though she did not name it at the time, that his gray eyes had, when he looked up at the tower, a certain look in them that she recognized because it was very close to the look she had seen in her own eyes in the small handheld mirror she kept above her wash basin. Winifred Ashby came out 3 days after that in a small mule cart driven by a young man from the settlement. She brought a basket. In the basket were 6 eggs, a small round loaf of sourdough, a jar of green tomato preserves, and a folded shawl of undyed wool. She said the shawl had belonged to her own daughter, who had died of a fever at the age of 12, some 50 years past, and that she had kept it in a cedar chest all these years, and that it seemed to her that the time had come to let it out into the sun again. She said Ellie should not thank her for it. She said it was a thing that wanted to be worn. Ellie put the shawl on. She did not thank her. Winifred sat with her for an hour at the small pine table. She drank tea. She talked in her clear, calm voice about the small daily business of the canyon. Who was ill? Whose lamb had been born? Whose son had begun to court? Whose daughter? It was a kind of talk Ellie had not heard in her whole life. It was the talk of women in a place where women had known one another's names for a long time. She listened. She did not say much, but she felt sitting there in the borrowed shawl with the cup warming her hand. Something loosened behind her ribs that had been tight there for 13 years, and she did not name what it was, and she did not want to name it. Some things you leave unnamed. That is how they keep. On the 11th morning, Hank Bradley's freight wagon came up the trail from Purgatory Springs. She saw the dust of it from a long way off. She stopped what she was doing, which was staking a small pen for the two young hens Winifred had promised her, and she walked out to meet him. Hank drew the mules up in the tower's shade. He climbed down slowly. He did not smile. He rarely smiled, but this morning his face had a set to it that she had not seen before. He said, "Miss." She said, "Mr. Bradley." He said, "There is a matter." He told her what the matter was. 2 days ago, he said a man he had not seen before had come into the livery in Purgatory Springs. A well-dressed man, Boston hat, Boston boots. This man had inquired in a friendly and general way about the freight arrangements in the town. He had asked which of the freighters serviced which routes. He had asked in particular who had lately been running the Calico Spur. Hank had told him what any freighter in that town would have told any customer. He had said yes, he serviced that route, and that he was not the only one, and that his rates were fair and his schedule flexible, and had the gentleman a load in mind. The gentleman had smiled. The gentleman had said that no, he had no load in mind, only an interest. He had then produced from his coat a folded envelope. He had laid the envelope on the workbench. He had said that inside the envelope was $100 in banknotes. He had said that this $100 was a retainer, and that in exchange for the retainer, Hank Bradley was to make himself unavailable for the next 6 months, to haul any load bound for Lot 73 of the Calico Spur survey, or to any point along the last 5 miles of that spur, or to any settlement in the canyon country east of the spur. The gentleman had said that if this arrangement was agreeable to Hank Bradley need only pick up the envelope and their business would be concluded. The gentleman had said that if this arrangement was not agreeable to Hank Bradley, that was of course his right. But he should perhaps consider that certain other freighters in other towns had already accepted similar arrangements, and that Hank Bradley might find himself competing in the near future with certain aggressive new pricing on other routes, and that a man of his age and station might wish to give the matter thought. Hank Bradley had listened to the gentleman without a word. When the gentleman was finished, Hank had walked around his workbench to the door of the livery. He had opened the door. He had stood beside it. He had said without raising his voice, "Get." The gentleman had smiled again. The gentleman had gathered his envelope. The gentleman had gone. Hank had come out to the flats the next morning at first light because he had judged correctly that Ellie ought to know. He also told her the second piece of it, which she had begun to guess before he said it. The mercantile owner in Purgatory Springs, Mr. Halloran, had been called upon by the same gentleman that same afternoon. Halloran had, per the story Hank had heard from one of the boys who swept at the store, taken the envelope. Ellie's next order of milled lumber and iron nails and roofing tar, which she had placed the week before, would be unavailable at any price Mr. Halloran was prepared to name. The store owner had cited a supply disruption. He had regretted the inconvenience. Ellie stood in the shade of the tower with her arms folded. She listened. When Hank had finished, she said only, "Thank you, Mr. Bradley." "That ain't all, miss," Hank said. "No," she said. "I did not think it was." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his weathered face did the small, quiet thing that in another man would have passed for a smile. "You'll do," he said. "You'll do, miss. I'll haul your load. I'll haul it out of Black Rock instead of the Springs. It's a day's ride further, but the roads are honest. I won't take that man's money, not for $100, not for 1,000. She said, "Mr. Bradley, I would pay for a second wagon load if you were willing to bring it. I would like to lay in enough of what I need to see me through 6 months in case worse comes." He said, "It is coming, miss. I would lay in a year." She nodded once. She paid him a deposit against the 2 loads. He climbed back onto the wagon. He went. She stood a long time in the shade of the tower after his dust had gone. Then she went into the shack, and she sat down at her small pine table, and she took out the water rights certificate, and she laid it flat in front of her, and she looked at it. She was not afraid. She had time enough now to know that she was not going to be afraid of Jasper Vance. She had heard his voice already once, 3 weeks before she knew his name on a wind out of her uncle's office. Some fears you use up in advance. some fears you never get to feel a second time. But she also knew that Vance was not the end of the matter. Because a man like Vance, when he moved on a piece of property, did not move alone. And there was somewhere a man who had put him on to her. There was a man who had known where she was going and why and what she had. The next afternoon, that man rode up to her door. She was outside when he came. She had been splitting a length of scrap pine for the stove, and she heard the hoof beats before she saw the horse. And she straightened slowly with the hatchet still in her hand and turned to face the trail from the west. There were two riders. She knew both of them before they were close enough to hail. The lead rider was her uncle Warren Whitfield on the tall bay gelding he had ridden for 15 years. The second rider was a small, dark-suited man in a bowler hat who could only be a lawyer. They drew up perhaps 20 feet from the shack. Warren did not dismount. Warren looked at her from the saddle. Then, in the slow way he had of taking in the shape of a piece of property that he was thinking of buying, he let his gaze travel up, and up, and up, until he was staring at the peak of the great iron tower 60 feet above him against the pale afternoon sky. He stared at that tower for a long time. Then he brought his gaze down. He looked at Ellie again. She had seen many expressions on her uncle's face in 13 years. She had never seen this one. It was the expression of a man who has just discovered that the thing he was reaching for in the dark is larger than his hand. "Eleanor," he said. "Uncle Warren," she said. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to speak. Warren raised a hand without looking at him, and the lawyer stopped. "Get down," Warren said. He said it to himself or perhaps to the horse, and he dismounted. He walked the reins to the hitching post she had set up beside the shack. He tied the horse. He turned back to her. His face had recovered its usual set. His usual set was not a kind one. "There is a matter of business, Eleanor," he said. "It concerns this parcel. I have come to resolve it. Mr. Hoke here has drafted a document. I would like you to sign it. When you have signed it, I will pay you a fair price for your interest in this land, and you will come back to the ranch, and this misunderstanding will be at an end." She looked at him. She said, "What price?" He said, $500. She said, "The land clerk in Purgatory Springs valued this parcel 3 weeks ago at $86.50. He said, "And I am valuing it at 500 because I am a generous man and because I am your family and because I do not wish to see a young woman make a foolish decision she will regret." She said, "Uncle Warren." She said it in a voice so quiet that Mr. Hoke, the lawyer, sitting his horse 10 feet away, had to lean forward to catch it. "Uncle Warren," she said, "how long have you known Mr. Jasper Vance?" There was a silence. It was a silence of the kind that is longer than it seems, because the mind of every person present is doing a great deal of work inside of it. Warren's face did not move, but his eyes did. His eyes flicked once in the direction of the lawyer and then flicked back to her, and in that flicker she saw everything she needed to see. She said, "You have known him some time. I heard him in your office 3 weeks ago. I heard you laugh at what he said about me. I am asking now because I would like to hear it from you how long." Warren's mouth worked. He was for the first time in 13 years having to think in her presence. Finally he said, "6 years." She said, "6 years." "He came to the ranch 6 years ago," Warren said. His voice had lost the smooth business tone it had come in with. It had gone flat. "He had a proposition. He had come across records, old survey records. He was piecing together the situation on the Calico Basin. He needed a partner in the county, someone with land next to the spur, someone who could arrange things without questions. And you were that someone. I was that someone. Yes. And when you arranged 6 years ago to enter into that partnership, what was I?" Warren looked at her. "You were a complication," he said. She nodded slowly. She had known already. It was not a hard thing to hear. She had heard the harder version of it 3 weeks ago on the wind. "Say the rest," she said. He looked at the ground. "Say the rest, Uncle Warren." "He said your father surveyed the section in 1888, on his last survey trip the summer before the fever. He surveyed it for the territorial office and he made his notes and he came home and he told me when he was passing through the ranch that fall about a certain small anomaly. He had come across a certain matter of a standing tower and a certain aquifer and a certain old water rights claim in the name of a signalman named Hollister. He told me because he was tired and it had been a long trip, and I was his brother, and he did not know at the time that it mattered. He mentioned it once. He never mentioned it again. The following autumn, he was dead. He stopped. Go on, she said. I remembered, he said. I remembered when Vance came to me in '96. Vance had heard rumors about the basin. He was piecing together fragments. I had a fragment he did not have. Your father had told me the name of the signalman. Hollister. That was the thread we needed. From that thread, we could work out where the paper had gone. It had gone with the widow to Tucson, where she had died 4 years ago. Ellie went very still. She died 4 years ago, Ellie said. Yes? And you knew. We knew. Vance had a man in Tucson to look. And she left the paper here. We assumed she had. We could not confirm it. We could not enter the property. We were waiting for the parcel to come up for tax sale. It was going to come up next year. Vance had already made arrangements at the land office. She looked at Mr. Prescott in her memory, and she saw again his shaking hand as he had written out her deed. She understood now what she had been looking at. Prescott had been terrified because he had sold to a 19-year-old girl in a mended dress with $87 in a manila envelope. The piece of property he had been paid a great deal of money to hold aside for a Boston speculator. Prescott had done it because he was a small, mean, weak man who had, in a single moment of professional cruelty, forgotten which side of his own bread was buttered and had sold her the parcel to enjoy her disappointment. He had probably realized his error before she had reached the door. He had probably lived the last month in low, continuous terror. She almost in that moment felt sorry for him. And when I heard him in your office, she said, when I heard him say what he said, that was because Warren said you were the last complication. You were the last person alive who might, by the terms of your father's original entry, have a claim to any portion of this section. Vance and I agreed. It was cleanest if you were sent away with a small settlement. If you were sent into country, you did not know. If you were sent alone. To die. He did not answer. To die, Uncle Warren. He did not answer. He looked at the ground. She stood there for a long moment. The wind moved in the iron legs of the tower above her and made its low humming sigh. And she was aware in that moment of the sound, the way she was aware of her own breathing. It was the sound of the country she had walked into, the sound of the place her father had prepared for her. She said, "Get on your horse, Uncle Warren." He looked up. She said, "I am not going to sign your document. I am not going to sell you my land. I am not ever again going to stand in a room where you have set out the conditions of my life. Get on your horse. Take your lawyer. Ride back to the ranch. If you send another man out here on my land, I will have him removed by the sheriff at Black Rock, who is not, I understand, in Mr. Vance's employ. If you or Mr. Vance make any further move against the parties who trade with me in the towns to the north, I will file through counsel that I intend to retain in Tucson this month a formal complaint with the territorial office regarding the entry your Mr. Prescott made against this parcel and the payments that he received in exchange for holding it aside. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" He did not answer. "Do you understand, Uncle Warren?" He nodded once. "Then go," she said. High went. He mounted his horse. Mr. Hoke turned his mount without a word. They rode out along the western trail. Warren did not look back. She stood in the shade of the tower with the hatchet still in her hand and watched them until they were small, dark shapes on the horizon, and then smaller, and then gone. When they were gone, she set the hatchet down on the chopping block, and she sat down on the block beside it, and she put her hands flat on her knees and she breathed for a while. She did not cry. That would come later, some other night, over some other small thing that had nothing to do with her uncle. She had spent, at the age of 19 years, the last of the tears she was ever going to spend on Warren Whitfield. Winifred Ashby came to the shack the following afternoon. She did not ask what had happened. She did not need to. Word travels along a rail line, even a rusted one. She sat with Ellie at the pine table. She drank a cup of tea. She said at last, "Child, there is something I have not told you, something that is not mine to have kept from you, and yet I have kept it because it is not fully mine to tell. I am going to tell it now." Ellie waited. Winifred said, "The blacksmith, Ezra Kane." "Yes, Ezra Kane is not the name he was born with." Ellie set down her cup. Winifred said, "He came to the canyon 12 years ago. He walked in one morning at the age of 30 wearing a suit of clothes that had seen better days, carrying a small carpet bag, and asking in a voice that was almost a whisper whether we could use a smith. He said his name was Ezra Kane. We were short a smith. The old one had died the winter before. We put him to work. He was good. He was very good. He asked for no wages beyond his room and board for the first 2 years. He built the forge that stands there now with his own hands. He has been with us since." Ellie said, "And his true name?" Winifred said, "His true name is Wesley Hollister. He is Cora and Nathaniel's boy." Ellie put her hand flat on the pine table. She did not speak. Winifred said, "He told me the 3rd year he was with us. He told no one else. He told me because I was the elder here, and because the arrangement with his mother's paper had to be respected, and because he could not in good conscience live inside that arrangement without at least one soul in the canyon knowing why. I gave him my word I would not tell. I have kept it for 9 years. I release myself from it now because you have come, and because the shape of things has changed, and because his mother is old, and because I do not think, child, that a young woman who has been what you have been should have to sit down at any table without knowing who is sitting at the other side of it." Ellie said quietly, "Why did he not go back to her?" Winifred said, "Because he had gone east at 19 to make his fortune, and he had failed. He had failed in 3 cities over 10 years. He had done things in those 10 years that he was not proud of. He had drunk more than he should have. He had lost money that was not his to lose. When he finally decided to come home, he had nothing to bring her. He rode as far as Purgatory Springs. He heard at the livery that his mother had gone to Tucson to live with her sister 5 years before. He heard that no one had heard from her since. He turned east instead of west. He walked into the canyon. He asked to be Ezra Kane." Ellie said, "Cora died 4 years ago." Winifred said, "Cora died 4 years ago in Tucson." Ellie was silent. "Then he does not know," Ellie said. "He does not know." Ellie stood up. She walked to the door of the shack. She stood in the doorway and looked out at the tower for a long time. Winifred did not follow. The old woman sat at the pine table with her hands folded and her cup cooling, and she waited. At last Ellie turned around. She said, "I am going to Tucson." Winifred said, "Child, she has been dead 4 years. There is nothing in Tucson." Ellie said, "I do not believe that. She wrote a letter meaning it to be found. She had a sister. There will be a house. There will be papers. There will be, perhaps, some final thing she wanted her boy to have. If I can find one such thing, and if I can bring it back to the canyon, and if I can put it into Wesley Hollister's hand, then his mother will have finished her sentence. She started it in a shack. She should get to finish it." Winifred looked at her for a long moment. Then the old woman nodded once slowly. "Take the mule," she said, "and take the young Delaney boy with you as far as the depot at Black Rock. It is a long ride to Tucson. You will not go alone." Ellie went. She was gone for 11 days. She rode with the Delaney boy, a quiet 17-year-old with sunburned cheeks, as far as the small rail depot at Black Rock, where she left the mule in his keeping, and boarded a southbound train with a small leather satchel containing $60 in gold and a change of clothes. The train ran through country she had never seen. She sat by the window and watched it go by, and she thought of her father and of Cora Hollister, and of a small wooden bird carved by a boy of 9, sitting by a hearth in a country he did not yet know he would leave. The train ran south through low-rolling desert country dotted with mesquite and palo verde, and then through a stretch of higher land where the greasewood grew thick along the wash bottoms, and then into a broad valley of pale grass that turned gold in the afternoon light. She had never in her life been on a train. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her leather satchel between her feet, and she watched the country go by outside the window with the still attentive look of a person who knew that she might never see any of this again and did not wish to waste it. An old man across the aisle from her, a rancher by his hat and his boots, offered her a piece of hard candy from a paper twist. She thanked him. She took it. He asked her where she was headed. She told him Tucson. He asked her whether she had people there. She said, "I have someone I need to find." He nodded. In the way a man of that country nods when he understands that a young woman on a train alone with a small leather satchel is not to be inquired of further, and he said only, "God travel with you, miss," and he went back to reading his paper. She sucked the candy slowly. It was peppermint. It tasted like a childhood she was not sure she had really had. Tucson in 1902 was a low, pale city of adobe and dust that lay in a broad valley under a ring of hard blue mountains. She took a small room at a boarding house on Meyer Street. She spent the first day walking. She spent the second day at the county records office where a young clerk who was not Mr. Prescott, who was in fact quite kind, helped her locate the last known address of Mrs. Cora Hollister, widow, late of the Sonora Flats. The address was a small adobe house on a quiet street near the old Presidio wall. Ellie walked there in the morning. She knocked. The door was opened by a woman of perhaps 60, gray-haired, with the same clear, pale eyes Cora Hollister must have had, because it was Cora's sister. Her name was Mrs. Eugenia Bell, no relation to Cyrus, though Ellie's heart tripped at the name. Mrs. Bell had been a widow herself for many years. She lived alone in the small house. She had cared for her sister Cora for the last 13 years of Cora's life, until Cora had died quietly in her sleep in the spring of 1898. Ellie stood on the doorstep and told Mrs. Bell plainly who she was and why she had come. Mrs. Bell listened. She invited her in. She brewed tea. She sat down opposite Ellie at a small kitchen table, and she looked at her for a long moment, and then she stood up without a word and went into the back of the house. She came back carrying a small pine chest about the size of the tin box that Ellie had found in the hearth. "My sister," said Mrs. Bell, "kept this by her bed every day of the 13 years she lived in this house. She told me before she died that if ever a person came to my door who had lived in her old shack and who could describe the small wooden bird she kept in the top drawer, I was to give this chest to that person with her blessing. I have waited 4 years. No one has come. Describe the bird, child." Ellie described it: the dark walnut, the mended wing, the chip repaired with pitch. Mrs. Bell's eyes filled. She pushed the chest across the table. Ellie carried it back to the boarding house. She did not open it there. She waited until she was on the train the following morning in a private compartment she had paid extra for with the door latched. She opened it there. Inside the chest were 3 things. The first was a folded quilt. It was small size for a child's bed. Its blocks were made from scraps of gingham and calico and a piece of blue chambray that had once been part of a boy's Sunday shirt. It had been made by hand by lamplight over many long winters, and it had been folded and refolded so many times that the creases were nearly worn through. There was a label sewn into one corner. The label read in a careful cross-stitch, "For Wesley when he comes home." The second was a bundle of letters tied with red string. Ellie counted 39 of them. They were addressed to Wesley Hollister at various addresses in the East. They were all marked in the hand of some indifferent postal clerk in a distant office. No such person, undeliverable return. Cora had written to her son every 3 months for 10 years after his letters stopped coming, and every one of her letters had come back. She had saved them all. The third was a small envelope unsealed. Ellie opened it. Inside was a single lock of dark hair tied with a strand of the same red string, and a slip of paper on which was written in the hand Ellie now knew as well as her own father's 6 words. His hair, when he was 6. Ellie sat on the train with the chest open on her knee, and the small quilt across her arm, and the letters in her lap, and the lock of dark hair in her hand, and she watched the desert go by outside the window, and she did not weep because there were not enough tears in her to answer what was in that chest. She closed it. She latched it. She held it against her chest for the rest of the journey. She was back at the canyon on the evening of the 11th day. She did not go to the forge directly. She went first to Winifred Ashby's small house, and she set the pine chest on Winifred's table, and she opened it, and she showed the old woman what was inside. Winifred looked at the quilt. Winifred read the label. Winifred put her hand over her mouth. "Send for him," Ellie said, "but do not tell him why." Winifred sent a girl. The girl went to the forge. Ezra Kane came in from the door with soot on his hands and his leather apron still tied around his waist. He was wiping his hands on a rag as he came in. He was saying in his low, patient voice, "Winifred, if it is about the wagon axle, I can have it done by Tuesday, but the second one will." He stopped. He had seen the chest. He had seen the quilt. He stood in the middle of Winifred Ashby's small kitchen, and he looked at that quilt for what seemed a very long time. His face did not move. His face did not move for so long that Ellie thought perhaps something inside him had frozen and would have to be thawed carefully over time before he could speak. Then without a word, without taking his eyes off the quilt, he lowered himself onto the wooden bench beside the table, as if his legs had ceased to hold him. Ellie said very quietly, "She waited for you." She did not say more. He reached out. He touched the small quilt with the tips of his fingers, the way a man touches something he has been afraid for a long time that he was not permitted to touch. He lifted a corner. He turned it. He found the cross-stitch label. He read the label. His hand shook. He read the label a second time. He put his face in his hands. I wept. He wept the way a strong man weeps who has held it in for many years and who has no arrangement in his life for the letting of it out, and who does not in the end need any arrangement because grief, when it comes, finally finds its own room. He wept into his hands and his shoulders shook, and he did not speak, and no one in that small kitchen spoke to him. Winifred Ashby got up. She walked to the stove. She poured a fresh pot of coffee. She set the pot on the table between them. She sat down again. Ellie sat with him. She put one hand on his forearm. She did not squeeze. She did not pat. She simply rested her hand there so that he would know, when he was ready to know it, that someone had been present with him for the crossing. After a while, he lifted his head. His face was raw and open, and he did not try to compose it. He said, "She wrote me. She wrote me letters." Ellie said, "Yes." "She wrote me for 10 years. "Yes." He looked at the bundle. He did not touch it. "They came back," he said. "They came back because I moved, because I kept moving. I did not want her to find me. I did not want her to know what I had become." "They came back," Ellie said. "She saved them all." He closed his eyes. He said, "She would have forgiven me." "Yes," Ellie said. He said, "I did not need to be forgiven yet because I did not yet know I would be. I could have gone home." "Yes," Ellie said. He put his face back in his hands. But this time it was not weeping. It was only the long resting of a man against his own palms, in a kitchen that was warm with coffee in front of him, and a quilt his mother had made him folded on the table, and the knowledge that he had come home at last to the country his mother had left him, and had not after all been unwelcome there. He rode out to the tower alone 3 days later on the small gray mule. He did not send word. Ellie saw the dust of him coming, and she recognized the shape of him in the saddle, and she stopped what she was doing, which was pulling weeds from the small patch of ground she had turned for a fall garden, and she stood up and waited. He drew up in the tower's shade. He dismounted. He tied the mule to the hitching post. He walked over to where she was standing, and he stopped a few paces from her, and he took off his hat, and he held it in both hands in front of him, the way a man holds a hat when he has come to say a thing that he has been practicing on the ride out. He said, "I have come to thank you." She said, "You do not need to thank me." He said, "I have not been able to sleep since the evening in Winifred's kitchen. I have sat with the quilt across my knees every night. I have read 3 of the letters. I cannot yet read more than 3 at a time. There are 39 of them, and I intend to read every one, but slowly one every few days, because I do not want to be finished with her, do you understand? As long as there are letters I have not opened, she is still writing to me. Ellie nodded. She did understand. He said, I have come to tell you something. He looked down at his hat. He turned it slowly by the brim. He said, when my mother lived here, she had a small stone she used to keep on the mantle. It was a piece of turquoise no bigger than a fingernail that she had picked up on her walk south from the wash the first summer they moved here. She used to say when I was a boy that it was a piece of the sky that had fallen down for her to keep. She used to hold it in her palm on the cold nights and warm it before the fire. I do not know what became of it after she left. I doubt it survived. But I wanted you to know, Miss Whitfield, that there was such a stone, because you are the person who lives in her shack now. And I thought you should know one small thing about her that was hers that did not fit in a letter. Ellie was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her apron. She drew out her father's compass. She held it out to him in her open palm so that he could see the small sliver of turquoise set at the pivot of the needle. My father, she said, set that into the compass he made me for my 7th birthday. He said it was a piece of the sky to guide me on the earth. Ezra Kane looked at the compass for a long moment. He did not touch it. He said at last, your father was a good man. She said he was. He said, Miss Whitfield, if you will let me, I would like to come out here now and then. Not often, not enough to be a nuisance, but now and then. There are small pieces of ironwork I might make that could be useful to you. And I think if I am to be honest that my mother would have wanted me to know the person who lives in her shack, if that is agreeable. She said, it is agreeable, Mr. Hollister. She used the name deliberately. It was the first time it had been spoken aloud between them. His eyes met hers, and something in his face which had been formal and careful softened by a degree. And he nodded once, and he put his hat back on his head, and he mounted the mule, and he rode away. He came back over the weeks that followed 5 or 6 times. He never stayed long. He brought her small things, useful things, made at his forge in the quiet evenings after his other work was done. A pair of iron hooks for hanging harness, a cast iron latch for the shutter of her window that would hold true against the strongest wind, a small bracket beautifully wrought on which she could rest her father's compass when she was not carrying it. Each time he came, he asked her quietly whether she had any word of her uncle or of the man Vance. Each time she said no, she had had no word but that she was expecting some in due course. Each time he said quietly, you will send for me then, if word comes. Not a question, not an offer, a statement. She always said, yes, Mr. Hollister, I will send. He always nodded. He always rode away. That night, back at her own shack, Ellie could not sleep. She lay on her cot in the small, warm dark, and she listened to the wind sing through the iron legs of the tower above her. And she thought of Wesley Hollister sitting in Winifred Ashby's kitchen with a small quilt in his hands. And she thought of Cora Hollister lying in a rented bed in a small adobe house in Tucson 4 years ago, dying quietly. And she thought of her own father lying in the fever bed at Willow Bend 13 years ago. And she thought for a long time about the strange way that love travels through the world after the people who first felt it have gone. Before dawn she rose, she dressed, she lit her lamp, she stepped out into the cold desert dark, she looked up at the tower, and she thought quite suddenly of a thing she had been meaning to do for a month and had put off because there had been no time. She had been meaning to climb it. She had been meaning to see what her father had seen. She waited until the first pale light of dawn showed at the eastern edge of the sky. Then she walked to the base of the tower. She set her hands on the rungs of the great iron ladder, and she began to climb. 60 feet is a long climb for a young woman in a long skirt, with the wind moving cold against her and the desert opening wider beneath her with every rung. She climbed slowly. She did not look down. She looked only at the rung above her, and the rung above that, and the rung above that. Her father had once told her that a person who is afraid of heights should look only at the next rung. Look at the whole ladder, he had said, and you will fall. Look at the next rung, and you will arrive. She arrived. She pulled herself up onto the small rail platform that circled the top of the great tank, and she stood at last 60 feet above the desert floor, and she looked out. She could see forever. She could see the pale, flat pan of the Sonora Flats stretching away in every direction, red and gold in the first light. She could see the far, low blue rise of the mountains. She could see the thin, dark line of the canyon walls that hid Calico Wash. She could see to the west the small, pale trace of the road that led back to Purgatory Springs, and past that to the country of her uncle's ranch. She could see above her the deep, clean sky and the last stars fading in it. She stood there a long time. She thought in that moment of her father standing on the same platform in some summer of some year of her childhood, with his brass transit and his leather satchel, and looking out at the same country. She could feel him. She could feel his hand on her shoulder the way she had felt it under the stars in the yard at Willow Bend when she was small. She turned to walk the platform once around. And there on the far side of the tank, set into the iron of the outer wall, in a small square recess she had not been able to see from below, was a small iron door. It was not more than a foot square. It was hinged at the bottom. It had a simple latch. It was set flush into the metal, and if the sun had not been catching it at just the right angle, in that moment she might have walked past it and never known it was there. She lifted the latch. She opened the door. Inside the small recess was a metal box. It was heavy. It had been placed there with care. Its lid was sealed with a strip of oilcloth. She lifted it out carefully, and she sat down on the platform with the box in her lap, and she opened it. Inside was a leather-bound field notebook. It was her father's. She knew the leather. She knew the small brass clasp. She knew the hand-tooled TW on the front cover. It was one of a set of a dozen she had grown up with spread across his workshop table. She thought she had known where every one of them had gone. She had been wrong. She opened it. The first page bore in his fine looping hand the words, Field Notes Calico Spur Survey Summer, 1888. She read the notebook slowly on the platform while the sun rose over the eastern flats. He had surveyed the section that summer. He had come across the Hollister water rights in the records. He had verified them. He had determined from the survey lines that the water rights encompassed not only the standing tower, but the entire aquifer beneath a 5-acre parcel. He had gone to the Territorial Land Office in Tucson in October of 1888, and he had with his own funds purchased that 5-acre parcel and had filed the deed in a trust and had named as sole beneficiary of that trust a certain minor child. Eleanor May Whitfield, age 5. He had done this a year before he died. He had told no one. He had entered the trust in a Tucson office rather than the county office because he had not wanted his brother to see the filing. He had planned, according to his own careful notes, to inform his daughter of the trust on her 16th birthday, by which time she would have been old enough to make her own decisions about it. The trust included instructions that it was to be held quietly and paid out only upon her personal application at the age of majority or upon her marriage, whichever came first. He had died. The trust had gone unclaimed. The land held in trust in her name had over time reverted to the territory for want of tax payment because a child in a line shack half a mile from the main house had no way of paying taxes on a piece of land no one had told her she owned. It had been returned to the general inventory. It had sat dormant in the ledgers of the Territorial Land Office for 13 years. Until one summer afternoon in 1902, a 19-year-old girl had walked into that office with $87 in her hand. Ellie sat on the platform for a long time with the notebook in her lap. The sun climbed higher, the desert warmed. Below her, the small shape of her shack, in the small dark thread of the rusted rails, in the small distant smoke from the canyon of Calico Wash, were laid out like a map her father had drawn for her. She had come to a piece of desert on the strength of $87 and a laugh. She had climbed a ladder on a hunch. She had opened a door because the sun had caught it at the right angle. She had found at the top of a tower the last thing her father had left her, which was not the land and not the money and not the water. It was the knowledge that he had believed she would come here. He had known she would come. He had waited for her to come. He had left her the notebook because he had known that on some morning in some year She would climb the tower. She closed the notebook. She held it against her chest for a moment. Then she put it back in the box, and she latched the small iron door, and she climbed down the ladder rung by rung, and she did not look down, and she did not fall. The summer wore on. The heat grew heavier as June turned to July. The wind changed from soft to hard and back again with the passing of small distant storms that never quite reached the flats. Ellie went about the business of a woman on her own land. She made her second trip to Tucson in the middle of July, this time by train from Black Rock, and she engaged a lawyer named Everett Hayes, an elderly gentleman of quiet competence, whom Winifred Ashby's cousin had recommended, and she filed with him formally the complaint against Mr. Prescott regarding the arrangements he had made with Jasper Vance concerning her parcel. Mr. Hayes read the complaint. He read her father's notebook. He read the water rights certificate. He read the deed. He looked at her over the top of his spectacles for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Miss Whitfield, I have been practicing law in this territory for 41 years. I have very seldom seen a case as clean as yours is going to be once we file. May I proceed?" She told him he might. She paid his retainer in gold. She rode home. She heard in the weeks that followed various small pieces of news from the world beyond the tower. Prescott had been suspended from his post at the land office pending inquiry. Vance had returned to Denver and had been observed by parties Mr. Hayes had employed for the purpose, spending long hours in the company of his own attorneys. The Territorial Commission had opened a file. The file had begun to grow. She did not follow the details closely. She trusted Mr. Hayes to follow them. She had a shack to see to and hens to feed, and at Ezra's suggestion, a small vegetable plot to break for a fall planting. She had begun to trade eggs and mended shirts with the folks of Calico Wash, the way Cora Hollister had done before her, and she had begun to keep her own small ledger in her own careful hand in a new pine-covered book she had bought in Tucson. Her ledger did not resemble Warren Whitfield's ledger. It was full of names. She thought of her father in the long slanting evenings sitting on the doorstep with a cup of coffee in her hand and the tower rising behind her. She thought of him more now than she had thought of him at any time since he had died. She thought of him because he had come back to her in the notebook in a way she had not had him in 13 years. She could hear his voice again. She could hear the way he had said her name. She could see his ink-stained hand guiding hers across a sheet of vellum. She understood becoming the woman he had prepared her to be. It was a slow becoming. It was a good one. The drought came in the late summer of that year. It was a drought of the kind the old people spoke of afterward as the drought of '92, meaning the second one because there had been another of its size in 1892, and this was its equal or its worse. The rains did not come in July. They did not come in August. The washes that had run in the spring were dry pans of cracked mud by the 1st of September. The seep at the south end of Ellie's 5 acres slowed to a thread and then to nothing. The Calico Basin held because the Calico Basin was fed from far away, and slowly, but the surface creek in the canyon at Calico Wash ran low and warm. The ranches to the west and south did not hold at all. She heard on Hank Bradley's next haul what had happened at the Whitfield Ranch. The cattle were dying. The tanks were empty. Warren had bought hay through the summer at ruinous prices, and now the hay had run out. His partnership with Jasper Vance had 3 months earlier collapsed in some manner. Hank did not fully understand involving accusations of misappropriated funds and the sudden departure of Vance to Denver, where he was said to be under some form of investigation by the Territorial Commission that Ellie had in fact quietly initiated the previous spring through Mr. Hayes. Warren was ruined. Warren was Hank set alone. Cordelia had gone to stay with her sister in Prescott. The wedding of the son Robert had been quietly postponed. On a morning in mid-September when the sky was white with heat and the wind was hot even at dawn, a single rider came up the trail from the west. He was on the same tall bay gelding Warren had ridden in the spring, but the gelding was thin now and the rider was thinner, and his coat was dusty and he sat in the saddle the way an old man sits at the end of a long day. He stopped his horse at the base of the tower. He did not dismount at first. He looked up at the tank the way he had 6 months before. Then he looked at Ellie standing in her doorway with the borrowed shawl from Winifred over her shoulders and her father's compass in her pocket. He did not speak. He could not, she saw. He had come with words rehearsed on the long ride out, and the words had left him at the sight of the tower. She said, "Uncle Warren." He said, "Eleanor." He said, "I have 42 head of cattle. I had 800 at the beginning of summer. The 42 will die by the end of the month if I do not find water for them. I have come to ask you for water." She looked at him for a long time. She said, "You did not come with a document today." He said, "No." She said, "You did not come with a lawyer." He said, "No." She said, "You are asking." He said, "I am asking." She stepped down from the doorway. She walked past him. She walked to one of the great iron legs of the tower, and she put her hand flat against it, the way she had put her hand against it on the first morning. She stood with her hand there for a long moment. Then she turned back to him. She said, "I will give you enough water to save your 42 head, not more. I will let you drive them to the tank I have built at the south of my land, and I will fill it once and once only from the standing pipe. That will be enough to bring your herd through this drought if you manage it carefully. It is a gift. It is a gift I do not owe you. I am giving it to you because my father taught me a thing my father did not have time to teach you. Do you know what he taught me?" Warren shook his head. He was looking at the ground. She said, "He taught me that a ledger is a small, poor thing, that a person is not a line in it, that when you close the ledger on a person, you do not close them out of the world. You only close yourself out of them." She said, "You close the ledger on me, Uncle Warren. I am closing it now on you. I am closing it by opening a pipe." He did not answer. He could not. She said, "Drive your cattle in tomorrow at first light. I will have the tank filled and standing. Do not come again. Do not send word. Take the water. Save the herd. Go home, that is all." He nodded once. He turned his horse. He rode back down the western trail without another word. She watched him go. When he was small on the horizon and then smaller and then only a smudge of dust against the pale sky. She walked back into her shack, and she sat down at her small pine table, and she put her hands flat on the wood, and she breathed slowly for a while. She did not feel triumph. She had thought once that she would. She did not. What she felt instead was the small, quiet emptiness a person feels at the end of a piece of business that has been finished cleanly. It was the feeling her father had she now thought at the end of every long survey, the feeling of the line being complete, the feeling of the map being closed. Warren drove his cattle in at first light the next morning. He did not speak to her. She did not speak to him. She stood in the doorway of the shack in the borrowed shawl and watched him bring his thin herd across her land to the tank she had built, and she watched him fill their bellies with the water from her pipe, and she watched him drive them off again in the long slanting light of the afternoon toward the western trail. He did not look back at her. She did not want him to. That was not what any of it had been for. She never saw him again. Word came over the following months that he had sold what remained of the ranch to pay his creditors and had gone to live in the small clapboard house that his wife's sister kept for boarders in Prescott. Word came that he had been seen in the churchyard there on Sunday morning sitting alone speaking to no one. Word came in time that he had died in the winter of 1907 of an illness of the lungs. Ellie sent no flowers. She sent no letter. But on the evening the news reached her, she sat for a long time on her doorstep with her father's compass in her hand, and she watched the last light fade over the flats, and she thought quietly of a hard man who had learned in the end that the ledger closes both ways. She hoped without being certain that in his last months he had understood the lesson. She thought perhaps he had. She did not know. Some things you do not get to know. The sun set that evening, 6 months after his ride out to the tower in a long, slow gold, and the desert cooled, and the wind changed and began to blow soft out of the north. Ellie stepped out of the shack and looked at the tower one more time. She thought standing there that she would climb it. She climbed the ladder in the last light. She reached the platform. She walked around it slowly once. She thought of her father. She thought of Cora Hollister. She thought of Wesley in Winifred's kitchen with the quilt in his hands. She thought of Warren Whitfield turning his thin horse toward the west. She took her father's compass out of her pocket. She laid it flat on the iron railing of the platform. She waited for the needle to settle. It settled as it had settled 1,000 times on True North. The small sliver of turquoise at the pivot caught the last light and glowed like a fleck of sky. She thought of the small, carved wooden finch that sat on the shelf beside her bed in the shack. She thought of the leather-bound field notebook that sat on the shelf beside the finch. She thought of the water rights certificate that sat folded in an oiled envelope in the small, strong box she had bought in Tucson and had bolted to the wall of the shack beneath the shelf. Her three inheritances, from her father, from Cora Hollister, from herself. Below her in the canyon of Calico Wash, 5 miles to the east, the first small yellow squares of lamplight were coming on in the windows of the small adobe houses. Winifred Ashby lit her lamp every night at sundown. It was one of the fixed points of that country. Ellie could not from here see the light of Winifred's kitchen because the walls of the canyon were in the way, but she could see the small, pale glow above the canyon that meant always that the lamps were coming on. Somewhere in one of those houses, Wesley Hollister was sitting at a table with his mother's quilt across his knees. He did that most evenings now. He did not speak of it. He simply sat with the quilt in his lap and drank his coffee, and if a person happened to pass by his window in the evening and glance in, they would see a strong, quiet man in his middle years, sitting alone at a scrub pine table with a folded quilt across his lap, reading nothing, saying nothing, but no longer alone in the way he had been alone for a great many years because his mother's hands were in the quilt, and his mother's hands had come at last to rest on him. Ellie picked up the compass. She closed it in her palm. She stood on the platform of the great iron tower with the last light of the desert on her face, and she felt for the first time in her life that she was standing on ground she owned. Not because the ground had been given to her, but because she had walked to it, because she had climbed to it, because she had along the way kept a promise to a woman she had never met, and honored a boy who had come home too late to be forgiven by the one who would have forgiven him, and closed a ledger with a man who had opened it against her in a room where she had not been permitted a chair. She was 19 years old. She had walked into the Sonora Flats in the spring of 1902 with $87 and a small brass compass. In the fall of that same year, she stood at the top of a 60-foot iron tower in the country her father had chosen for her, and she was the keeper of the water of the Calico Basin, and she was the friend of the hidden people of Calico Wash, and she was the daughter at last completed of Thomas Whitfield, cartographer, who had known that every line led somewhere. The wind moved through the iron legs beneath her with its low humming sigh. The sun set. The stars came out one by one, layer on layer, down into the deep black of the desert sky. She found Polaris the one that held. She looked at it for a long time. She thought of her father's voice, low and unhurried, saying, "If you are ever lost, find that star and you will find your way home." She had been lost. She had found the star. She had come home. Not to the home she had been born into, which was gone and would not come again, but to the home her father had made for her before he died quietly without telling anyone, in the small hope that his daughter would, at the age of 19, be the kind of woman who could walk to it. She was that kind of woman. She had walked to it. She was standing on it. She looked at the star a while longer. She thought of Hannah Doyle and the rose petal in the handkerchief, and Cyrus Bell and the lesson about words being like weather. She thought of the neighbor woman at Willow Bend who had set aside the pine trunk when everything else was sold. She thought of Cora Hollister sitting alone in the same shack in 1885, folding a letter to a stranger. She thought of the 31 families who had walked into a canyon 41 years ago, rather than let a Boston syndicate write the end of their story. She thought of every small hand that had held hers briefly along the way and had let go and had trusted her to keep walking. She was not alone. She had never been alone. She had only for a long time been unable to see how far the love in the world had traveled to find her, or how many of the people who had loved her had died before they could tell her that they had. She stood on the tower a little longer. The stars deepened, the desert cooled. Somewhere far off a coyote sang and another answered, and the wind carried the two voices thin across the flat pan of the country. She picked up her father's compass from the railing. She slipped it into her pocket. She turned toward the ladder. Then she began slowly to climb down toward her small warm shack and her stove and her lamp and her bed.